Good morning and welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Evan Sankey. I'm a policy analyst with our Defense and Foreign Policy Studies program. It is our honor to host you for a day of discussion and exchange about the present and future of U.S. policies to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. In the spring of 1963, President Kennedy said he was haunted by the feeling that the number of nuclear powers might grow from 4 to 15, 20, or 25 by the end of the 1970s, and that this constituted the greatest possible danger and hazard to the United States. 60 years later, this fear has not materialized. The number of nuclear-armed countries has ticked up only slowly to 9, a number held in check by many factors, including expense, threat perceptions, but also by the use of American power, by generations of U.S. presidents and policymakers to cajole, threaten, and punish friends and foes alike to forgo the nuclear option. This mission became a consensus feature of U.S. grand strategy, strongly influencing our decisions about alliances, overseas military deployments, our nuclear posture, and whether to wage wars of choice. But growing resource strains on U.S. grand strategy and the growth in both our major political parties of constituencies favoring military restraint compel us to ask whether policymakers should or will continue to regard the non-proliferation mission as an absolute imperative of U.S. foreign policy. Today, we're pleased to welcome 9 distinguished experts to the Cato Institute to share their views and insights about these topics. Our first morning panel will address the effectiveness of U.S. efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to U.S. adversaries. The second will look at the challenge of friendly nuclear proliferation. And after lunch, our third panel will ask how U.S. non-proliferation policies interact with our nuclear posture and employment strategy. And with that, I turn the floor over to our first panel. Justin Logan, the director of our Defense and Foreign Policy Studies program, will be the moderator. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks very much, Evan, for that kind introduction and useful setup. You stole one of my Kennedy quotes. I will forgive you for doing so. My name's Justin Logan. I'm the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies here at Cato, but I do have to acknowledge that this is very much an Evan Sankey, Ben Giltner production. They've put a lot of work into pulling it together, and I'm grateful to them and in their debt for their having done it. So our task this morning to kick things off is this question of U.S. policy toward adversarial proliferation, perspective, notional or otherwise. And it's a shame there's nothing in the news that should cause this to be of interest to a general audience, but we'll have to make do with what we have. We're going to have 3 panelists to discuss these questions this morning. The third is imminently, I think, being mic'd up. So I'll just kick off by talking about, it was interesting, Evan mentioned this question of Kennedy's predictions, and the panelists here will be rolling their eyes at having dug these up once again. But in 1960, Kennedy feared that there would be 10, then 15, then 20 nuclear weapon states by 1964, right? So it's kind of a scary prospect. But then by 1963, he had to update that to say, well, hang on, by 1970, unless we're successful, there may be 10 instead of 4, and by 1975, 15 or 20. So there's always been this sort of fear that we're at some imminent cascade or tipping point or point of no return, or dominoes fall, nuclear dominoes falling is another thing that's come up. And yet, as Evan pointed out, we still remain at 9 nuclear weapon states in the international system. Also, as Evan pointed out, what determined that? Well, it's overdetermined, right? We have a series of rules and restrictions, laws, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the additional protocol, the U.S. military in some cases, U.S. diplomacy in other cases. So as much as I crack wise, and I may still, about the rules-based liberal international order, there are these institutions, and proliferation has been over-predicted for decades. So we're going to talk about all those variables in the discussion kicking things off this morning. I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll have a sort of structured conversation where I've already tipped my hand and let them know some of the questions that they're going to hear, but we'll have a discussion of these questions. The first panelist is James Acton, who holds the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and is co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on a range of nuclear policy issues, including the impact of emerging technologies on nuclear strategy. I'm truncating these bios severely. They're much more prestigious than my vocal cords can churn out this morning. His PhD is in theoretical physics from Cambridge. Bob Peters, who I assume, I've always called you Bob. I hope you like to go by Bob. That's what I've been calling you for a long time, is the acting director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for National Security at the Heritage Foundation. Previously, he served in a variety of national security positions in and around the government, including at DTRA, at NDU, and at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He is a graduate of Miami University and Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. And hopefully, presently, being mic'd up right now, is Richard Nephew, who's a senior research scholar at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, as the kids call it. He's a leading expert on sanctions, non-proliferation, and policy on Iran. He previously served as Deputy Special Envoy for Iran at the State Department under the Biden administration, and also worked in the Obama administration on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and he holds both a BA and MA in Security Policy Studies from GW. So, Bob, I wanted to start off with you, put you on the hot seat here right out of the gate, and it seems to me that, you know, even in recent months, but certainly in recent years, there's been an evolution and perhaps differing opinions in conservative circles on these questions of nuclear non-proliferation, right? I can remember back as far as the six-party talks regarding North Korea's nuclear program, to the attacks on Syrian nuclear facilities, and of course, Iran policy from 10, 12, 14, 16 years ago to the present. And you know, a lot of people would say, well, you know, the conservative position has been sort of like diplomatic maximalism backed up by the threat of force. And that's as reductionist as it sounds. But I wanted to ask you, are conservatives still sort of primarily focused on that counter-proliferation, if you like, that sort of approach to it, or maximalism in diplomatic negotiations? Or do you see a shift on where conservatives are getting at these questions?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here at Cato, and what a lovely building you all have here. So thanks again.
Thank you.
First of all, I don't speak for all conservatives. I don't think anyone can, given that the conservative movement is within, you know, has about 3 or 4 warring camps within it at any given time. But generally, I think what you can say is that, you know, by and large, there's a common view that we're pro-arms control. And I think that President Trump has made that clear. I mean, it's well known that he's had an allergy to things nuclear for about 4 decades. Perfectly understandable, but that arms control must be multilateral. I mean, I think this idea that we should have bilateral arms control that excludes China in particular is kind of a dead letter amongst most conservatives. Again, with the caveat that this is not all conservatives. But I think there's at the same time a recognition that that's not going to happen anytime soon. I think generally speaking, most conservatives look and say this is probably not going to be a reality for the next 10 years, and so we're going to be existing outside of a framework that existed from about 1970 until the expiration of New START. You know, can we still engage in maximalist pressure? Yes, we can, and I think we should, but I think there's a recognition that that type of pressure is probably going to be less effective as we go forward. And that's by and large a response to the fact that the world is increasingly going into 2 separate camps. So you've got the status quo camp, that's largely the West, and then the democracies in the Pacific, led by the United States. And then there's the revisionist camp that's led by Beijing with their partners in Moscow and Pyongyang and Tehran. Our ability to put pressure on those regimes is not going to be that effective. And so I think that there is probably an increasing recognition that if we really do want to stop proliferation, it's going to have to come down to a kinetic action. So leave it there for now.
Got it. No, that covers the waterfront, and it was a very unfair question. You were fair to say it was unfair, and no doubt this will continue to come up in the discussion this morning. I wanted to move to James to talk about, if I don't want to reduce, I've reduced all morning, I'll keep reducing things, but if we will, the other side of the sort of general non-proliferation debate has focused on and succeeded in some ways with what I talked about in the opening, these sort of international restrictions, the NPT. We came up with the additional protocol, which was an amendment to the NPT that sort of imposed on the Iranian question. And I wanted to ask you a similar question about sort of, again, not to say there are sides in the debate, but there kind of are sides in the debate. Where is the center of gravity, if you will, in what I would call the sort of traditional NPT-focused non-proliferation nuclear policy right now? You've worked on technological change and how technology is changing some of these questions. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that landscape?
Sure, and it's great to be here. You know, Bob emphasized by saying that he didn't speak on behalf of all conservatives. I want to emphasize that I absolutely do speak on behalf of all liberals. And anybody who contradicts me from my side of the debate is wrong. No, that was a joke. Right. Look, I would say, at least for me, I am increasingly concerned about proliferation going forward. I actually think the most potential proliferators are US allies. The most serious one, Iran, is a US adversary. And, you know, you're going to be discussing allies later in the day, and I'm not going to get onto that now. But just suffice to say that, you know, I think the proliferation problem is as much about allies as it is about adversaries. But I do subscribe to the idea that we have, or at least had, a rules-based nuclear order. That states were willing to do stuff, such as impose sanctions, that they wouldn't have otherwise done because of the economics and bilateral costs, because they viewed non-proliferation as a global good, as a common interest. They also refrained from doing stuff, like supplying sensitive technology, that otherwise they would like to have supplied for economic and bilateral reasons out of the belief that non-proliferation was this global good. This was partly normative. I think there is this kind of hand-wavy normative element to it. I also think there was a very hard-nosed interests calculation that went into this. And neither do I think this was purely diplomatic. I think the threat of force was an important component within this broader regime. And I would see three changes, which I'm going to outline very briefly, that I think really do threaten the nuclear order today. Now, Justin said very fairly, there's been doomist predictions about non-proliferation for a while, and maybe you can invite me back in 15 years, and we can reassess whether I'm being overly too much of a doomer right now. But the first thing is, I think the attack on Iran was deeply problematic from the standpoint of the regime, because it demonstrated that actually underground enrichment programs are really hard to destroy. And so the threat of force, which I do think was an important component of the non-proliferation regime, is now a less effective threat going forward. It's also demonstrated that we, the United States, are not willing to bear that large costs because we're very sensitive to oil prices. Secondly, I think there are potential proliferators who are adversaries have very legitimate reasons to ask the question. If we enter into a deal with the United States, will the United States uphold its side of the deal? Regardless of whether you think the JCPOA was a good deal or a bad deal. Hint, it was an extremely good deal, as current events demonstrate. But even if you disagree with me on that, I think one has to concede that signing a deal and then walking away from it makes it harder to sign future deals that the other side is going to believe we're going to abide by. I also think that bombing Iran twice while negotiating with them further underscored this dynamic. And then thirdly, I think there is growing, on the part of the United States here, double standards. Non-pro regime has always had double standards. I don't want to claim it was this kind of purer than pure thing historically and has now got all polluted. But I do think the problem of saying we're going to treat our allies and our adversaries differently is a growing problem. I think the India deal in 2003 under George W. Bush is a good example of this. The AUKUS deal under Joe Biden is a good example of this. The South Korea deal for South Korea to get nuclear-powered submarines under President Trump is a good example. The perennial discussions we hear about some kind of deal with Saudi to give Saudi enrichment technology. And I think this creates various normative regime-type problems. If we're going to supply our allies with sensitive technology, I think our adversaries are going to supply their friends, who are often also our adversaries, with sensitive technology. I think it becomes a lot harder to, for example, if Australia is going to remove nuclear material from safeguards, and I'm not terribly worried about Australian proliferation at all, I think it becomes much harder to normalize a diplomatic coalition to do things like sanctions if Iran moves nuclear material from safeguards. So I think this double standard is not just a kind of isn't it unfair type whine. I think it does create real concrete problems for enforcing the non-proliferation regime in a robust way going forward. Now, I certainly don't want to claim that the United States in any way is the sole cause of problems in the non-pro regime. It's clearly not. But I focus on the United States because, most of us here are Americans. That's the government that, to the extent we can influence anybody, is the government we primarily seek to influence. So that's why I focus on the United States. But as I say, I do think there are good reasons today to really question whether the regime that I think has worked fairly well, is now under unprecedented strain and threat.
Oh, that's very good, and it set us up for the question that I wanted to pose to Richard, which was, you teased this question, James, to a certain extent about sanctions being a tool here, and the question whether the regime can endure. Richard, I wanted to ask you, your sort of professional career, public service has focused at this intersection of economic coercion and non-proliferation, I think it's fair to say. And there are increasing debates about whether it's, potential challenges to the dollar, all these sort of ripple effect questions about the use of U.S., if you will, economic coercion, sanctions, to try to be, part of the stick, if you like, on the other end of non-proliferation policy. Do you share any of those worries, and if so, which? Or do you think that the basic shape of U.S. non-proliferation policy, as being backed by sanctions to that extent, can endure for the policy-relevant future?
No, thanks for the question, and thanks for your forbearance. As I clearly was dealing with scheduling issues, it's a good thing we timed this the way we did.
Perfectly done.
I think part of the problem with the question is it, to some extent, looks backwards from the most recent deal we have and looks forwards to a world in which the U.S. doesn't have economic preponderance. It makes an assumption you couldn't do this thing again because you'll never have such preponderance. And I think there are reasons to question both of those assumptions there. It's absolutely true we had economic preponderance and we're therefore able to apply it to address this one particular problem, that being Iranian proliferation. But it's not, I don't think, definitively true that that's the only way in which economic pressure could have been used as a way of putting pressure on the Iranians. It's not, I think, absolutely true that the United States is going to lose the ability to have pressure on future foreign nuclear programs or other proliferation programs for that matter. But it's just that we will unlikely have this level of capability in the future to act as unilaterally as we did, to be able to shape what we wanted the outcome to be as much on our own. So we're going to have to do things with a little bit less. And I think there are reasons to look at this in recent history and to make those kind of calculations. Because if you look back to the 1980s, for instance, we were trying to persuade Pakistan, for instance, not to go down the nuclear path. The sanctions that we were putting in place, while they had some impact, they clearly were not sufficient to sway Pakistani nuclear decision-making or Indian nuclear decision-making thereafter in 1998. If you had fast forward and put the U.S. economic position in place in 1984, for instance, would it have necessarily been the same? If we'd had the same tools at the time, would it have been the same? And I think the difference is that at a moment in time which we wanted to try and work the international economy to get to our national security objective, we just were supremely economically powerful in those 2000s and early 2010 period where we could exert a lot of pressure. I think the problem that I look forward to is that at this point we have now indexed that not as being a high water mark in which we could have done an awful lot, but now is the standard.
Baseline.
And I think this goes to the point about whether or not a better deal was going to be possible when Trump exited the JCPOA. I think you could absolutely look at the North Korea case, where we've now said, well, we did it here, so therefore we ought to be able to do it again. And I think the answer to all this is all these things are contingent on the moment in time. They're contingent on the capabilities you have. And so as our relative economic position does start to recede, as we are not, we may still be a top dog, but not necessarily the supreme top dog where no one is able to challenge us, we are going to still have national security priorities that we're going to want to advance. And we're still going to have economic tools and partnerships that we can work, but they will not be as effective. And the problem is that U.S. foreign policy decision-making has not caught up to that reality. And so that means, to me, not that we're not going to be able to do it, but that we're potentially going to have to accept more compromise than we are usually willing to accept. And that's going to be our challenge.
Right. I wanted to stick with you both to follow up on that question and to ask another one. I mean, to me, you're quite right to point out the unique moment in time position of the United States in the global economy is one huge factor, but also adversarial workarounds are a huge factor with which you're intimately familiar, of course. So it's almost like an arms race, right, where we're trying to apply a certain level of pressure and they're trying to get out from underneath that. So I wanted to press you to talk a little bit about how you see the landscape of sort of red teaming it, if you like, the ability to sort of slip out from under these things, not just because the weight of the United States, if you like, has decreased, but because the adversary is clever and they figure out how to get out from underneath the pain. So that's the follow-up. And then I also wanted to ask a little bit, we got like, I don't know, 16 or 17 minutes in before the word Iran was uttered. Let's just go there. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the recent Iran conflict and the ongoing decades-long Iran conflict. And in preparing for this, I was going back and rereading some of your work. And you had a sort of pessimistic, I would say, view in January 2025. By your reading, Iran was, if not at the precipice, approaching the precipice, pretty close to the precipice of getting the implementation that it would need to produce a nuclear weapon, and that the Trump administration should really put its shoulder into diplomacy, but if that failed, be prepared to back it up with the prospect of military power. And then more recently, in the sort of, not yet the wake, but during the current conflict, you worried that to the extent comprehensive sanctions relief or big sanctions relief was part of a settlement with Iran, that would potentially breathe life into a regime that might be prospectively tottering. I wanted to sort of give you first cut at, after you do the arms racing adversarial cleverness bit, what you think has gone right, what you think has gone wrong, and net it out in a very short, reductive answer.
Well, I mean, so for the first one, I'll just say thanks very much. Everyone should buy my book, The Art of Sanction. No, I mean, I think you're pointing to something that is just an intrinsic reality, not just of sanctions policy, but of all foreign policy dynamics, which is adversaries get a vote. And unless you're in a position to completely, achieve, comprehensive victory on day one, you're going to have to respond to the push and pull. And I think a problem with U.S. foreign policy, but I would again argue that this is a broader foreign policy challenge, is that you can never really be sure, is our strategy not working because we're not doing it well enough, or is our strategy not working because it was based on flawed assumptions, or is our strategy not working because the adversary is pushing back? And I think in any of those scenarios, the correct answer is to be engaged in a continuous evaluation process, trying to decide whether or not something has a reasonable and plausible chance of succeeding if you change your tactics, or do you have to go back to your baseline strategy? Yeah. And it's without a doubt that the Iranians have adapted their approach to our sanctions policy over the years. I mean, they weren't using front companies in the beginning. Now they are. They've even gone beyond that. For a long time, the Iranians were doing transactions through the normal banking system. They stopped doing that with their sanctions. They moved to more of a Hawala system. I mean, this is the adaptation that you should expect, and I don't think here it's any different. On the issue of stuff I've written. So, look, I think one thing that I believe that all academic articles need to have, or think tank pieces need to have now, is a given that section, right? do I think in January 2025 that it was reasonable to contemplate military action against Iran? Yeah, absolutely. But that's because we were at suboptimal Plan 12, right? At that point, we had made so many bad decisions, starting with the decision to exit the JCPOA in the first place, that we're now kind of stuck with, okay, given that we are here, what do we do now? And my sense at the time was that the Iranian breakout time had dwindled so low that if you did not achieve a diplomatic success and get to something akin to a JCPOA, you were going to be running a real risk of Iranian proliferation being not just theoretical, but actual. And I still think that would have pretty catastrophic implications for both the region and beyond as part of the non-proliferation system. We could debate that at other points, but that is the reason why, to my mind, it made sense to contemplate that in the context of robust diplomatic effort, being willing to go back into a JCPOA structure, working with international partners, all those sorts of things. Well, okay, now fast forward a year. Given that we've had 2 rounds of strikes, the IRGC now is as firmly in charge as they are. Look, now we're in a position of what do we think the possibilities of Iranian proliferation, and what do we think the possibility of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons? To me, I think they've gone up, and I think they've gone up as a result of all the strategic missteps that we have made and the choices that the Iranians themselves have made too. And this is where I get to the point about giving the IRGC-led system now a lifeline. My very significant worry is the MOU. Let's all call it the Versailles MOU, please. The Versailles MOU has given the Iranians an awful lot of income stream that they should probably be able to expect to have in perpetuity. That will help them manage the crises that they're under without changing the underlying strategic realities, which I think then gives us a lot of pause, I would hope, in terms of how we think both about our overall strategy issues and how we are developing our objectives and how we try and achieve them, and our willingness to adapt based on what we have done in the past. And I think my big risk that I see now is not just that other actors are going to see from this a lack of stick-to-itiveness, as James is speaking to, but I think more importantly, they're going to see that proliferation in the first instance was the right answer, that the correct decision was all the way back in 2003 to press forward, not to stop.
Right. You can't trust these people. That's the implication there. On their side, that is.
Right.
I'm trying to channel. James, I wanted to start working our way back in this direction with a general similar question. And there are obviously lots of non-nuclear issues in the U.S.-Iran strategy policy space. You're a nukes guy. So I wanted to ask you to talk to the extent you want, and feel free not to bracket away non-nuclear issues. You're welcome to jump on those as well. But on the nuclear case, Richard just laid out something. I saw you nodding your head at various times. What do you think has gone right and gone wrong? And I think there is probably some consensus on withdrawing from the JCPOA might have been had some ripple effects that were unpleasant for us. But what do you think the implications are for nuclear non-proliferation from wherever you see this going at present? Right, we have, as was pointed out, strikes last June, strikes starting February 28th of this year. All these questions of trust that are sort of structural to a Neanderthal realist like me, right? It's very hard to trust a country like the United States because it's so powerful and it can just renege on its word. To the extent you can see the ripples starting to form and emanate out, how would you identify them?
Sure. Let me highlight 3 ripple effects. The first one is the link between attempted regime change and proliferation. However you feel individually about what happened to Saddam, what happened to Gaddafi, what happened to Khomeini Sr., I think there's a pretty clear message that if you don't have nukes and you lose a war to the United States, or even in the case of Iran, if you win a war against the United States, you can end up dead. So, I think policies of regime change or leader change fuel proliferation. Secondly, I am deeply concerned. My primary argument against military force in Iran has always been that it would never work. And I think that's been borne out by what has just happened in Iran. Now, I want to emphasize, if I was President Acton, which is constitutionally not going to happen, I would not take the threat of military action off the table. I do think it is a useful threat to have, and I do think it worried the Iranians a lot. But the problem is, if you have a dispersed, deeply hardened underground program, we have now demonstrated that it can survive US airstrikes. Not unscathed. But Iran has been left with large quantities of highly enriched uranium. They are not buried under rubble. They are in tunnels that survived. That was sealed by Iran because covering tunnels in sand is a really effective way of preventing bombing from collapsing the tunnel entrances. Because literally it's like pounding sand. So, you know, the idea that Iran lacks, the country that dug the tunnels lacks the technology to dig out the tunnels that they buried, when we've already seen them do it last fall, is like head spinning to me. There are now no inspections in Iran, other than the reactors that are not of particular proliferation concern. I see no evidence that the large quantities of centrifuges that Iran were being monitored under the JCPOA and now no longer being monitored, they almost certainly survived. Iran has large quantities of expertise. And perhaps most worryingly, Iran now knows, as does every other proliferator, how deep they have to dig to avoid the most penetrating US non-nuclear weapons. There is a reason we didn't actually bomb the tunnels at Isfahan, because they were too deep. We bombed the tunnel entrances, but the tunnels remained uncollapsed. We didn't even try, to the best of my knowledge, to destroy the facility at Pickaxe Mountain. So now every country out there knows exactly how to defeat a US air campaign. All of this, I think, makes the threat of military force less effective going forward. And finally, this war has demonstrated this was not, I've said this a few times publicly now, war is not a video game. You don't win a war by accumulating points. You destroyed the Ayatollah, 10,000 points. You destroyed this facility, 1,000 points, right? We scored 400 million points and the Iranians scored million, right? That's not how wars are decided. This war was about the infliction of pain. We inflicted pain on Iran. They inflicted even more pain on us economically by closing the Strait of Hormuz. That was why we ended up with a bad deal at the end of the day. Not primarily because the administration's not very good at negotiating, but because, as President Trump himself said repeatedly, he wasn't going to go back to war because the costs of that war were so painful that our threat to go back to war if there was no deal was a lot less credible than the Iranian threat to go back to war if there was no deal. That's why, this narrative that we won the war and lost the peace is wrong. We lost the war and we lost the peace. And generally, when you lose wars, you lose peace. And again, I think this demonstrates to other potential proliferators going forward that if they're engaged in a military conflict with us and they find some way of raising oil prices, and a number of potential proliferators are not all that far from the Middle East, then they can ensure that this war just becomes too costly for us to fight. So the good news here is, as I've said already, almost all potential proliferators going forward are US allies. I think we're in a terrible situation with Iran right now. I totally agree with Richard's analysis that the likelihood of Iran getting nukes is now significantly higher than it was 2 years ago. But what I would say is a number of potential proliferators I think are not necessarily long-term lasting friends. And that part of the reason we should care about proliferation to allies is that allies can change into adversaries. And, the Islamic Republic of Iran being the absolute classic example of that.
Fair enough. I wanted to continue working back in this direction. I hope you have a somewhat different take on the Iran policy. But to set it up, it's fair to say, I think, and objectively true, that there's been a lot of volatility in Trump's Iran policy, right? It built up to February 28th with the strikes last June. And efforts, I will say, at diplomacy led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. But now Trump has sort of moved from initially talking about regime change, urging the Iranian people to rise up. It's the greatest chance in a generation for them to do so, by saying that the new crop of leaders in Iran are actually the bros. We love those guys. They're good guys. And sort of, talking about we can do business with them. They're responsible people, and pushing this MOU and the prospect of a broader deal covering the whole host of issues between our countries and other parties in the region in a really short period of time. And so, the Trump administration has, engaged in a pretty big, pretty costly war. It's now taking a lot of heat for its efforts at diplomacy. What is your take on the prospects for a kind of enduring peace, maybe if not even some grand denouement, but just a sort of stable equilibrium coming out of this that looks all right?
Yeah, so, you picked up that I may have some disagreements with Richard and James, and I'll touch on that a bit. But, I'm not even sure that whether or not we have an enduring peace with Iran, I'm not concerned with that. And I'm not even sure that that's in American interest, that we have an enduring peace with Iran. I would say what's in the interest of the United States is ensuring that the Islamic Republic does not pose a threat to the United States or regional partners. And I don't even know how long the Islamic Republic will continue to exist. I think it's going to be measured in months to years, not years to decades. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I would guess. And I disagree with some of what James and Richard said as the status of the nuclear program. I'm happy to talk about that. But from my vantage point, I think we set the program back roughly 20 years. I think it's going to take them roughly 20 years to get back to where they were pre-2025. Their economy is in ruins. We've killed a number of scientists. We've killed significant aspects of the program itself. Can they rebuild some of those? Yeah, if they've got the resources. Can they dig out some of those facilities? Yeah, they can. But if that means that we need to go back and continue to kill Iranian leaders and IRGC commanders and scientists and destroy sites of concern, we can keep doing that all the live long day. I'd prefer to do that with gravity bombs, not long-range precision fires or deep penetrating strike capabilities, because we want to maintain those to deter, if necessary, defeat Chinese aggression. But, I look at this as a place in which we can continue to inflict pain and costs in Iran so long as we need to. And James, you said a couple times that we lost the war. I take your point that war is not a video game. I'm not sure anyone has made that argument that it is. But when you look at how much we have affected the Iranian regime, and this idea that, well, now the IRGC is in charge and the hardliners are in charge. Well, hardliners have been in charge since 1979. I'm not sure that we're going to see any meaningful change in behavior. What we are going to see is a change in capabilities. When you talk about we suffered more economic cost than the Iranian regime, I don't see that as being possible. I filled up my gas tank last night. It was only about 30 cents more a gallon than it was before the war began. That's about 9% more. The Iranian economy before Epic Fury was not in a great place to begin with. I don't see it as being in a stronger place now, given the amount of rebuilding that they're going to have to do. Now, the MOU, which is not the final agreement, it's an MOU. Supposedly the final agreement will come out 60 days from now or whenever. We don't know what that's going to look like. Maybe it'll give more money to the Iranians. Maybe it won't. If I've learned anything from watching Trump 47, it's don't bank on what he says now to still be viable 60 days down the line. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But Richard, what I would say to you when you said that the lesson is if you want to keep your regime, go for nuclear weapons. What I would say is I think if you see Epic Fury as a counter-proliferation effort, you're engaging in a category error. In that, I think if the October 7th attacks had not happened, we would not have seen Midnight Hammer or Epic Fury. I think if the protests that erupted in December through January that killed between 20 or 40,000 Iranians, however many people you want to count it, if that hadn't happened, you would not have seen Epic Fury. Everything that I've heard is that the nature of the regime is what triggered Epic Fury. And the attacks in particular of October 7th deeply affected the president. And I've talked to multiple people and they've said if those attacks had not happened, if the killing of the protesters had not happened, we would never have gotten Epic Fury. You'd have seen this president continue to try to engage in negotiations. much like we saw in 2018 with North Korea. Maybe they very well have failed like they did with North Korea, but we would not have gotten to this level of kinetic action. So.
I have 50 thoughts of my own, and I'm going to do what I never do, which is not share them with anybody. I don't know whether, yeah, James, you have a two-finger there?
Yeah, I think this is so important, this issue of analyzing the effects of the war, and I want to disagree with Bob on 3 points. Actually, I want to start by agreeing with him. I think Bob is absolutely right that it could take the Iranians 20 years to build back a program of the size it was previously. The problem is they don't need a program of that size to build the bomb.
Right.
The program they had previously was massively oversized for proliferation. Don't get me wrong, it was partly geared towards proliferation, but it was also scaled for fuel production. You know, with the amount of HEU they have, a very small underground centrifuge facility is now entirely adequate for building the bomb. Secondly, Bob argues we can keep going back. I think that's wrong, because I think it's now clear that deep, hardened underground facilities we can't touch. You know, there was a reason we destroyed a whole bunch of stuff in last June's war. And in this year's war, there were very few strikes against nuclear facilities. Not none, but very few. And that's largely because what we hadn't destroyed last June, we now can't destroy because it's too deep. And at the end of the day, if you're dealing with underground facilities, once you get below, you know, whatever it is, 100 meters, give or take, non-nuclear weapons simply cannot destroy those facilities. My implication here, I want to be very clear, is not that I think we're going to use nuclear weapons, it's that we're not going to destroy those facilities. And then thirdly, I'm not arguing the United States incurred more economic costs than Iran. I'm arguing that we incurred more economic costs than we were willing to bear. And you know, when it comes to gas prices, look, Bob and I both earn good money. It's not a problem for me that I pay more at the pump. But, you know, we all know that inflation brought down, or was a major reason that brought down the Biden administration. And many Americans who are on much lower incomes are really hurt by rising gas prices. And, you know, there was, you know, based on every piece of media reporting we've had, you had a Republican Party that was begging the president to stop this war because they believed it would be disastrous to their hopes in the midterms. I think they got the analysis the political economic analysis there spot on.
There's a famous quote in nuclear context about suffering that mentions if we have to eat grass, we will see this through. And so I think it's a question of how much suffering either side is willing to. Richard, did you have a two-finger on this also?
Yeah, and I don't want to pile on, but I mean, I will say two things. One, if we believe that the IRI only has weeks or months, this MOU is making sure it's more months to years. The simple reality is that the Iranians are going to get disproportionate economic benefits over what they got in the JPOA, which is the appropriate equivalent to the MOU, to the tune of something between $4 and $6 billion a month in oil sales, as long as the MOU is in place. And while it might be plausible that the United States could undertake additional military action at the end of 60 days, I actually think the president is signaling all over the place a disinclination to do so. And here I'm not talking about the words he's actually using as Truth Social posts. Here I'm talking about when he makes those posts, what does he do? And what he has done persistently since April is said something very extravagant and then said a couple hours later, great news everybody, the Iranians conceded, now I get what I want, and so I don't have to do this. And I think that is marking out a disinclination to act that will directly impact his decision at that end of 60 days with regard to the MOU and whether or not it's extended. And if it is extended ad infinitum at $4 to $6 billion a pop, you can absolutely count on the Iranians having more than enough money to rebuild what parts of the program they haven't. And the last thing I'll just say on the category error part about what happened with Epic Fury and whether or not we'd have had it without January, that may or may not be true. If it were true, it's inconsistent with the president's rhetoric, which is absolutely focused on the CP elements, whether we're talking about the nuclear program or the missile program. And point of fact, the people who killed all of those protesters in January are absolutely unequivocally the only power center in Iran right now. So if he cared about what happened in January, he has a very funny way of showing it to those much less radical people who are now in charge.
We have seeded the field. Everyone is on the edge of their seats, no doubt, which is a good time to turn to the question and answer period. The online people can pose questions on Facebook, YouTube, or X using the hashtag Cato FP. So go ahead and do that. We're going to take some of the questions from in person, some of them from online. If you're in person, it says here, please speak clearly and directly into the microphone, which I would have thought would be self-evident, but it must not be. So everybody in the room and online can hear the question. And please announce your name and any affiliation. Ask smart questions. There's tons of them out there. You're smart people. The gentleman right down here in the front row, or not the front row, almost the front row.
Hi, I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. My great fear is that with a working Chinese design in hand, Iran will not have to test. Their test may be on Tel Aviv, and I don't know how to keep an eye on that and watch that very carefully. My question is, can you name some proliferation targets? Iraq's come to mind, of course. And maybe Saudi Arabia, but I can't think of any others.
Thank you. I don't know if I quite, the question whether Iran would need to test, I suspect they would. Does anybody have a, let's go to, I think I saw, we'll take another one. Is that Sahar? I can't see. Yes, it is Sahar, right there.
Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm Sahar Khan. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Institute of Global Affairs and former Cato person. So I had a question about conventional weapons. Of course, we sort of have ideas of what this means. You know, there are very few states who want nuclear weapons, but I wanted to ask all three of you what your thoughts are on what the Iran war indicates about conventional weapons and modernization. And when we think about proliferation, of course, it means nuclear, but I'm just curious because more and more states are developing really dangerous conventional weapons that could potentially do a lot of damage, as we've seen. Thank you.
Thoughts on the conventional deterrence, I guess.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in with a couple of thoughts. I mean, so first, just on whether or not Iran would need to test. Again, I'm not sure whether or not they would ever need to test, depending on what they're attempting to test. I think the question is whether or not they would wish to test. And I think this goes to a question of how they are approaching the underlying strategic logic of hedging versus now being more of a declaratory state. So I guess I think it's an important question, but I'm less motivated by it because my inbuilt assumption is that the Iranians would prefer to have a test in order to stabilize deterrence, but that may be wrong. On the conventional weapons piece, to me, I think what the conflict shows is very similar to what the Ukraine and Russia war shows, which is drones, and the importance of drone warfare going forward, the adaptability of drone warfare, the integration of drone warfare and strategic intelligence to be able to target. I think, to me, that and the cheap nature of drone production with the high consequence of getting a successful strike, that's what adds up to me to being fairly anxiety-producing as opposed to more kind of traditional conventional arms. But that's just me.
Yeah, so from my, look, I'm not a conventional weapons guy, but there are three things kind of looking at this from my vantage point that I noticed about conventional weapons in the war. The first one is the effectiveness of point missile defenses. You know, full credit, if you're defending small areas, point missile defenses are really impressive these days. No bones about it. Secondly, this war illustrated both the, and taken together with the last one as well, the abilities and limitations of conventional bunker busters. Going back to last June's war, the Pentagon briefing that explained how the attack on Fordo was done, the underground enrichment plant. I mean, it was Battle of Yavin from Star Wars stuff, right? I mean, it was dropping the photon torpedoes down the, I mean, like almost literally. So on the one hand, it was like, I thought this war was a terrible idea, but like you watch it and you're like, this is amazing. But, you know, the fact on the one hand, the destruction of Fordo, genuinely impressive. But as I've already said, the limitations of that technology is demonstrated by the deep underground facilities we didn't destroy. And thirdly, I think there's fascinating lessons about the ability to and limitations of hunting mobile missiles. You know, US and Israeli operations proved very effective at hunting down Iranian mobile missiles after they had left their garrisons. Iran proved very good at keeping those missiles inside underground facilities alive, at constantly reopening those underground facilities, at getting them through and sustaining after, the Iranian fire rate dropped pretty dramatically after the first few days, but then it remained pretty much constant. So, I think those are three aspects of the conventional warfare that I think were noticeable from my perspective.
I broadly agree with both James and Richard. I think that when we think about, for me, when I think about deterrence, I actually think far more about conventional capabilities than nuclear capabilities, which is why I advocate for we need more Virginia submarines, we need more destroyers, we need more bombers, we need more long-range precision fires that are air-launched and sea-launched and so forth. I think the only way to do that without breaking the bank is to do this high-low mix with drones and autonomous systems, where you're talking about CCAs or what we've seen on the ground in Ukraine, mixed with things like LRASMs and TLAMs and so forth. I think the missile defense aspect, yet again, has proved just how good it is when it comes to point defense, but even beyond point defense. What we've seen THAAD can do is pretty darn impressive, which I would offer goes beyond even just point defense.
Good, but expensive and in short supply.
Correct, yes.
Let's see, other questions. There was somebody right there. Right there.
So my understanding is that's the next panel, right? Is talking about additional countries that potentially are going to proliferate, including on the allies. Friendly proliferation.
For adversary proliferation?
This is the adversary proliferation.
Right.
Right there, there's a lady in the back area with her hand up, conveniently. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Abby. I'm a sophomore studying political science with a focus on international relations. And I had a question about how the potential development of independent nuclear weapons by Europe could possibly affect the war in Ukraine. Would it hasten it? Would it hasten the end of it? Or would it exacerbate it?
That's an excellent question for the next panel, which is on the prospect of proliferation to current U.S. allies, not adversaries. So if you will, sorry for being the jerk who says it, but will you ask that exact same question in an hour and 20 minutes? Awesome. Thank you very much. Gentleman right here.
Hi, Andrew Yo, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and Professor of Politics at Catholic University. James, I want to go back to your comment about mixing regime change and proliferation or non-proliferation, because I'm really struck by the fact that I've been following North Korea for a while, but both in North Korea and Iran, you have this underlying intent or perhaps ambition in the U.S. To promote regime change at various points in time. But at the same time, you're trying to negotiate with an adversary to ask them to give up nuclear weapons. And so it gets back to this fundamental question of trust. Seeing now that Iran has been struck once last year in Midnight Hammer and then again Epic Fury, where do you see negotiations happening? Why would the Iranians trust the U.S. at all? And given that fact, how do we move towards denuclearization now? Thanks.
I don't think they will trust us. Part of the reason why I'm worried about whether there will, firstly, I think it's unfortunately unlikely there will ever be a final deal with Iran. And secondly, if there is, I worry that it would be one that concedes an awful lot to the Iranians. But I think, the basic point you make, I think, is just spot on. That, even after the war and signing an agreement respecting Iran's, I forget the exact wording of Article 1 or Paragraph 1 of the Versailles Memorandum, but respecting Iran's territorial integrity and pledging not to interfere in internal affairs. President Trump is making threats against Iran again. And if I'm Iranian, I'm sitting there and being like, we cannot, any kind of an agreement that we reach, we cannot trust that it will be durable. And, to my mind, I've written about what I think in a final agreement with Iran should look like. I think we've got the memorandum now. I think we should try and build on it. I think we should negotiate with them in good faith. I would prefer a detailed memorandum that's a detailed final agreement with good verification that's more permissive to Iran, that gives Iran more benefits. But that doesn't actually solve the fundamental problem that you point to, which is that, any Iranian leaders looking at this agreement have to ask themselves very seriously whether the United States will abide by that agreement. And, this is why I think the US, this is a broader conversation than just Iran, but there is a number of agreements in which our counterparty was complying with that agreement that we chose to exit. We have the right to do so, for example, in the case of the ABM Treaty. In the JCPOA, there was no exit clause because we didn't want the Iranians to be able to exit the agreement. And then we chose to exit the agreement, which I view as deeply problematic when the IC was assessing that Iran was complying with that agreement. But I think that at the end of the day, I don't have a good answer to this problem. I think it's very hard, not just for Iran, but for any adversary right now to have any confidence that the United States will abide by an agreement that we sign. And I think it's a huge problem for non-proliferation. I think it's a huge problem for our foreign policy writ large, frankly.
I mean, it wouldn't be a good nuke panel if somebody didn't quote Schelling. Nobody has so far, so I will. In threats, there should be implicit an assurance, right? So Schelling uses the threat, stop or I'll shoot, which logically implies if you do stop, I won't shoot, right? And if you think about it in that sense, to what extent can we credibly assure any prospective party, if they do stop, we won't shoot? I mean, I think that's the...
Can I just pilot, well, especially I'm going to another question, just pilot. I do want to say, though, I think that there is a distinction there between regime change and not fulfilling the terms of your agreements, right? Fundamentally, the Iranians never believed that we had a new great relationship with them in 2015. There was an intrinsic amount of distrust that was still felt by both sides to one another. And the entire reason why we had to write 150 odd pages in the JCPOA was because of fundamental amounts of distrust that existed between the two sides. And I think the Iranians were prepared to look past whether or not we're, enemies forever in order to get to a constructive, pragmatic deal, the same way that we were prepared to do so as well. And I think you can still find a way to get to people's pragmatism, which I think is what's being demonstrated in the MOU. I think the problem that we had in 21, we were trying to get back into the JCPOA, what I think the Trump administration is going to find now, is that it's taken as given that we are adversaries. Now it's taken as given that we won't even abide by things that we agreed to 5 minutes ago. And I actually think that right now the reinterpretation of the MOU is a massive problem. When the Vice President of the United States goes out and says the MOU says things that it does not say, it signals to the Iranians that this doesn't matter. None of this matters. And if you're the Iranians, you sit back and say, okay, well, we're just going to exploit this to maximum advantage until the Americans once again cheat on us again. And when they've done that, we at least will have prepared ourselves. That, to me, is the more dangerous implication of JCPOA exit and this entire saga. It's not the regime change piece, although I take on faith the fact that that has an impact. I think it's even more on the specifics we're not able or willing to comply. And we are developing a reputation as someone that is incredibly capricious in that. And that, I think, is more dangerous to us than whether or not we're permanent adversaries.
Thanks. I think I've screwed up the online questions, so I apologize to the online people because I'm not making it work. So blame me, please. Let's take two. Well, holy moly! Now everyone cropped up.
Escalation.
Let's take the escalation. That's right. A cascade fell. Let's start with the lady in the back, and then work our way up at least to three, because we're getting to the end. We're gonna have to be extremely concise here, gentlemen.
Thank you so much. My name is Kendra. I recently graduated from American with my MPP, and I did research last summer about intelligence services and corruption at the University of Cambridge. I wanted to ask a question thinking about our adversaries. They have a lot of internal corruption within their system. So I was curious about the role when we consider our adversaries' internal corruptions when we're thinking about the U.S. grand strategy on nuclear proliferation. So how are we considering that factor when thinking about our strategy?
Thank you. Would you pass it right up to the lady right in front of you who had, we'll take three all in a row here. Thank you. Please.
Yes. Hi, my name is Chloe Irwin. I am a recent graduate of Liberty University and a current intelligence analyst intern. And my question for you is, given the ongoing war and events with Iran, we obviously know that they are a state sponsor of terror, have multiple proxies around the MENA region, around the world. And so given our discussion on proliferation, I guess my question is there a nexus between counter-proliferation strategy and counterterrorism strategy? And what would that look like moving forward with U.S. foreign and defense policy?
Thank you. And would you pass it up to the gentleman? Sorry. Thank you.
Eric Bordenkircher, UCLA Research Fellow. Kind of speaking along the lines of nexus and also kind of grand strategy here. This question, I think, falls between panels, but at the same time, I think is relevant. I'm coming at this more from a Middle East perspective than a nuclear perspective, but do these negotiations with Iran have an impact, or I should maybe say it differently, is the administration thinking about its negotiations with Saudi Arabia while it's negotiating with Iran? Does, you know, because with this nuclear cooperation agreement that's been brought up in Congress and, you know, concerns about that, and inevitably this situation in Iran has to have some repercussions there. Yep. So is that taken into consideration when we're negotiating?
Great, those are all good. Iranian corruption vis-a-vis a deal, Iranian support for terrorism vis-a-vis a deal, and ripple effects, interaction effects inside the region vis-a-vis a deal. Anybody? Please.
Let me deal with the corruption and terrorism questions together and try and answer that very briefly. I think we as the United States have to have a clear sense of priority and decide what we care about most. I say that because with the JCPOA, there was a criticism that the JCPOA didn't deal with terrorism, didn't deal with regional proxies, didn't do much on the ballistic missile program, and therefore, you know, and it gave Iran sanctions relief that Iran could put towards nefarious purposes. And at some level, that was true. But it's also the case that, you know, to my mind, the nuclear threat from Iran was where the United States' most fundamental interests were engaged. And I think it was a good idea to stabilize the nuclear issue in return for sanctions relief, even if we don't like what Iran may do with some of that sanctions relief. And this administration has reached exactly the same conclusion, right? The president who criticized the JCPOA because it didn't deal with ballistic missiles, because it didn't deal with terrorism, didn't deal with regional proxies, is now saying Iran has the right to a ballistic missile program. And I think the same thing is true with corruption as well. Like, I don't like the fact there's corruption in Iran, but like, we as the United States, I think that is not our core national interest here. So the bottom line is, I think we should identify our core national interest here as non-pro, and we should act accordingly, even if it means that other interests are deprioritized, put by the wayside, to put this very bluntly.
Please.
For the counter-proliferation, counter-terrorism nexus, I mean, that's something that, you know, people have been thinking about for 25 years. What I'd say is that within the region today, the terror problem is significantly less than it's been for quite a while. I mean, the Houthis have been relatively quiet since 2025. Hamas, there's still some of those guys that need to be killed. Hezbollah is a problem, and they're so deeply entrenched in Lebanon. I don't know how we get them unentrenched. I think the Iranian support's probably going to go down, but you know, we're going to probably keep doing what we've been doing for the last quarter century, is basically mowing the grass. And I know that's a term that's not popular, but I think that's the reality of what we have done, and so I'm going to guess something that we're going to continue to do. When it comes to negotiations with Saudis, look, I mean, I referenced the warring camps within the conservative movement earlier. I think on this issue, there's kind of two camps. One is we need to think about working with partners within the region and really try to support them, potentially with nuclear energy as well as conventional arms and so forth. And then there are those who say, I'm done with the Middle East. I do not want to be involved. We have no actual partners or allies there outside of Israel. Just walk away from it all. So, and that fight is not yet over.
Richard, concluding thoughts on these?
Yeah, just real quick. I'll part ways a little bit with James here on the corruption issue, because I think one of the problems that we've got within the internal Iranian system is the degree to which there's corruption. You also have the risk of that fueling proliferation if actors inside the IRGC system, for instance, decide to make a bunch of money off of the sale of materials or something similar. So I think one of the problems with corruption, even in adversary states, is it potentially can contribute to additional bad outcomes that you wouldn't necessarily want. Doesn't mean you don't prioritize, but it's an element there. And the last thing I'll say with regard to the CT-CP nexus, look, I think one of the things that does extend throughout all of this is the use of sanctions and other tools to try and address some of those concerns. Even within the context of the MOU and the license that was granted, there are still pieces there that say you can't do business with Hezbollah and similar. I think the problem that you have with less comprehensive sanctions regimes, as the MOU is going to create, it's just harder to do. And it's harder to try and execute them while you've got some areas of trade that are allowed, some levels of banking activity are allowed, and some that aren't. And so it is going to increase the difficulty factor of doing some of our CT work if some of our CP work is no longer prioritized in the sanctions enforcement realm.
It's a very good point. We are going to take a break of about 15 minutes before the potential allied proliferation or friendly proliferation panel, which will be moderated by Evan Sankey. There's going to be, I think, coffee or something outside, but for now, please join me in thanking the panelists for what was a rollicking discussion.
Fun as always.
Always a pleasure.
All right, everybody, we're going to get started shortly here. If you could take your seats, please. Thank you. We're about to get started with the second panel here. Thank you. So this morning, we heard from an excellent panel about challenges associated with proliferation to U.S. adversaries going forward. Now we're going to talk about friends. A core purpose of U.S. alliances and partnerships is to disincentivize friendly nations from developing their own nuclear arsenals. Beyond that, U.S. policymakers employ a range of carrots and sticks, multilateral treaties, extended deterrence promises and consultations, troop deployments, nuclear sharing, first-use nuclear strategies, threats of abandonment, and restrictions on transfers of nuclear technologies. But these policies are costly, and U.S. guarantees have inherent credibility problems. Why should an ally believe the U.S. would threaten nuclear use except in the case of an attack on the U.S. homeland? Recent developments exacerbate this confidence gap. The continued erosion of global norms against the use of force, the decline of U.S. conventional military advantages, especially in Asia, and the volatility of U.S. domestic politics. The nuclear option is now a matter of internal political debate in several close U.S. allies, including South Korea, Japan, Germany, and Poland. And serious debate about whether nuclear proliferation might sometimes serve U.S. interests has gathered steam in Washington, hopefully including on this very panel. Joining us to discuss the friendly proliferation debate are three distinguished scholars of nuclear policy issues. Astrid Chevroy is a visiting fellow in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's a career diplomat with the French Foreign Service, having most recently served in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Department at the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Her research focuses on European security, transatlantic relations, French defense policy, and nuclear issues. And she is the author of the excellent new CSIS report, Friendly Proliferation, Assessing U.S. Perceptions on Proliferation Among Allies and Partners. Jennifer Lind is an associate professor of government at Dartmouth College. Her research focuses on the U.S. alliance system in Asia, Japanese security policy, nuclear dynamics on the Korean Peninsula, metrics of geopolitical power, and Chinese political economy. Her latest book is Autocracy 2.0, How China's Rise Reinvented Tyranny. She's also the author of Sorry States, Apologies in International Politics, as well as co-author of the excellent international relations blog Blue Blaze, which I strongly recommend. And she's the co-author with Daryl Press of a piece published just yesterday in Foreign Affairs titled The Broken Nuclear Umbrella, What Comes After Extended Deterrence. And joining us in the room is Eric Brewer. He is Deputy Vice President at the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Nuclear Materials Security Program, where he leads work on nuclear nonproliferation, deterrence, and strategic stability. Before joining the Nuclear Threat Initiative, he served as Director for Counterproliferation on the National Security Council and as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation at the National Intelligence Council. His research focuses on preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, managing proliferation risks, and evaluating how non-proliferation goals fit within broader U.S. strategic objectives. His work has been published in the Washington Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and many others. So to frame our discussion here, Eric, I'd like to start by asking you what is the rationale for our current policy? You were a member of a recent Carnegie NTI Belfer task force, which concluded in part that preventing the further spread of nuclear weapons is central to U.S. national security and should remain a top priority. The United States should consistently and vigorously oppose proliferation to any state. Tell us why that is, what U.S. interests are at stake, and what are the costs that the United States is trying to avoid?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Evan. And one quick correction, I was not a member of the task force. I don't want to associate myself with that. I was on the staff
I see.
of the task force, but no, it's okay. So, I think in answering this question, I think it's important to kind of go back a bit, right, and recognize that since, roughly the mid-1960s, the United States has had kind of a blanket non-proliferation policy, right? We've aimed to prevent proliferation to allies and adversaries alike, and that has largely been true across Democratic and Republican administrations, although I think it's fair to say certain presidents leaned more into that than others. But I think a big reason that we've done that is not for normative reasons per se, but because we judged it was in our national security interest not to allow proliferation, not to have proliferation to either adversaries and allies. And I think there's a number of rationales that underpin that, right? And I think those were true in the mid-1960s, and I think for the most part, they're still true today. So those are things like, allies may not be allies in perpetuity, that allied proliferation could potentially induce arms races wherever it occurs, right? You can imagine if South Korea acquires nuclear weapons, what that might do to North Korea's calculus or China's calculus. Because more nuclear weapons in the hands of more states inherently increases the risk of nuclear war, either accidentally, through miscalculation, or on purpose. I think, if we're being honest too, there's also a belief that allies with nuclear weapons would force the United States to yield a degree of control over that ally and make it harder to manage crises, right? It's kind of obvious to say, but we can certainly control our own nuclear weapons. It's much harder to control the nuclear weapons of an allied state. And so there's a risk that we could get sucked in to a crisis or a conflict that we would otherwise prefer to remain outside of or to manage differently. And I think another big reason is that there's the process of proliferation itself is dangerous, right? We often focus on kind of, once we get on the backside of proliferation, if an ally has nuclear weapons, what are the risks or what are the consequences? But the process of proliferation, which is not, it's not a switch, right? It's not one decision, it's 1,000 different decisions. That very process could easily implicate U.S. security interest, including our security commitments to allies and partners. You can imagine an ally pursuing nuclear weapons and that causing an adversary to try to take action to try to stop it, either kinetically or through other coercive measures such as sanctions and diplomatic pressure. And so I think there's a number of concerns that we've had historically, and I think if you look at the world today, those concerns still bear out, right? The world is a more complex security environment. We have more nuclear weapon states today than we had, in the 1960s. And so I think, if you look at this list of reasons, one could say they were overblown, right? Like a lot of these things never came to pass. But I think the reason is because the United States spent significant effort and time building the international tools, building our own unilateral toolkit, building sort of the non-proliferation regime and the international system to manage them. And so I think if you look at, again, where we are today, the rationale for pursuing and maintaining that same system stands.
Thank you. I think it is fair to say that the perspective laid out in the NTI Carnegie Belfer report is still the consensus. But as our co-panelist Astrid Chevroy found in a recent study, things are changing. Astrid, I was hoping you could walk us through some of your conclusions. You write, the taboo surrounding friendly proliferation is eroding, giving way to a more open discourse and even public advocacy in some academic circles. Please tell us a bit about your findings.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be able to present these findings. So one thing that was really striking when I interviewed 42 experts on nuclear issues, ground strategy, and regional issues were that all of them told me that it was an overwhelmingly, or they overwhelmingly said that it was discussed in their circles. And that's something that was not, even the term is not something that I had heard before. And I was really surprised as a European in a think tank in DC to hear this term in the first place when I started, that's why I decided to do this, this study to objectify also this perception. And so all of them told me that it was a discussed contingency to talk about friendly proliferation. Nonetheless, the main finding really concurs with what Eric said, that, and the findings also of this other report is that the consensus still holds, but it's a minority who advocates for it. And half of the cohort, so 20 people out of the 40 who I interviewed, remain strictly opposed to friendly proliferation. And even the vast majority, 30 people out of 40, emphasize that they don't believe in a formal shift in official policy of the US for a ton of reasons that I think Eric explained very well, for military reasons, diplomatic, legal reasons, economic reasons as well, that would be very difficult to really measure. And I also found that there was a divide inside the US expert community on how they perceived friendly proliferation. Basically, what I found is that the more people know about the political, legal, even technical issues related to nuclear issues, the less likely they are to find that friendly proliferation is appealing, because probably they see a lot of constraints to it. But ground strategists and regionalists sometimes were more open to the idea. For the grand strategists, it's because they see the world in terms of balance of power, and it can seem appealing. It can be an appealing solution to solve some of the complex, balances of power between the US, Russia, and China these days. And for regionalists, it's more a question of strategic empathy, if I may say. They understand the rationale of the allies who might contemplate having nuclear weapons for regional security reasons or doubts about the strength of the alliances they belong to. Nonetheless, I think that also one of the findings that was interesting is that these different circles don't interact a lot between them. They work in silos, so they talk past each other, and people who are pro-friendly proliferation talk among themselves within a minority, and people from the consensus, the mainstream consensus, also don't interact a lot with people who think that friendly proliferation is a good idea. And it causes some problems, in particular in the perception of allied countries, where the discussion is sometimes not very well framed. And so it gives an idea or a perception of confusion inside the US strategic community, an idea of more permissiveness maybe for some of these countries. And so that's what's dangerous at the moment, is that there is not really a consensus, or at least an image of consensus in the US strategic community for these allies.
Esther, one of your most interesting findings, I think, had to do with the distinction between active and passive types of friendly proliferation. And I think you found that even among the minority of US scholars who are friendly proliferation curious, that the way in which they were friendly proliferation curious was in terms of the US perhaps stepping back in some cases, rather than actively assisting a friendly country in getting nuclear weapons. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And it's also because most of the people who advocate for friendly proliferation or show more openness are from groups of restrainers or conservatives who call themselves realists, whatever that means exactly. But for the restrainers, they prioritize usually, recentering the US interest on core, Western Hemisphere or a few theaters. And usually for them, it means placing that priority at the top of the list, and non-proliferation then becomes a second or a lesser important priority for US security. But the idea was really for these people to reduce, in the first place, US engagement abroad without really taking into account the negative impact of friendly proliferation. They didn't really want to see it they prefer to actually have this sort of silent acquiescence of the US if some allies were willing to proliferate, because it could lead the US to walk away from these theaters. But that was not an optimum solution.
Jennifer, in the past few years, I think starting in 2021 or two, you have argued that the U.S. should accept that some of its allies will go nuclear. Yesterday, in Foreign Affairs, you wrote, U.S. allies are vulnerable, and they are right to take concrete steps to reduce the real dangers they face, whether that means developing their own nuclear deterrent or making other moves that violate outdated U.S. prohibitions. Washington should support them along whichever path they choose for protection, and you go on to argue the U.S. should offer nuclear sharing arrangements or an extremist consent to them developing independent nuclear deterrence. Walk us through your case, because you are, I think, the most articulate analyst making these sorts of arguments.
Well, I think my co-author would dispute that, but but I appreciate it. Thank you. Hang on a second. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hang on a second. Okay. Great, thank you. We just had an AirPod mix-up. First of all, thank you so much for having me. This conference is just terrific, and this topic that we're talking about right now, we're increasingly seeing in the news, and so it just underscores how important it is. So yeah, I had a very timely release of our article yesterday. The essential argument that I make with Darryl Press, my colleague at Dartmouth and husband, co-author, is that the U.S. nuclear umbrella that we're talking about, it was really created for a very different era whose conditions have changed significantly. So for example, during the Cold War, when this was created, this promise that the United States would put its cities on the line for its allies' security was just barely credible. We know there was a lot of controversy about it, but it was just barely credible because of the truly global stakes during the Cold War. So Washington knew that if the Soviets gained control of Germany, of Western Europe, and so on, this would mean Soviet control of Eurasia, which was unacceptable in the eyes of US leaders in terms of a core security threat. So today, things are different. Conflicts are much more regional in nature. There's not this threat of global Soviet domination or global anyone domination. And so, for example, a war in Eastern Europe is essentially about the borders of Russia, borders of Russian influence, not about the global balance of power. So that's a key thing, which is the change in stakes that we've looked at. And then secondarily, it's the Trump administration national security approach, which is one, of course, of America first. And America first directly contradicts a pledge to wage nuclear war on behalf of your allies, to put your cities in the risk of the adversaries' missiles. So those are the two key things that have changed, and we argue have weakened deterrence toward our adversaries and have led a lot of allies to be very concerned as well. So in this situation, we don't argue that here's the right path. We're not advocating that the allies get nuclear weapons and so on, but we're saying we get it. The things have changed so much, that the US has changed so much. Their core security is on the line, and they may indeed make this decision. And so the United States needs to think about how to support them.
Can I jump in on it?
Absolutely.
So just to, I think, to add to what's been said already, I think all of us can certainly put ourselves in the shoes of our allies and can imagine, right, why they might be contemplating going down the nuclear weapons pathway. But I think as we talk about, these conversations that are happening in allied capitals. Oftentimes we refer to, allied debates about whether or not to pursue nuclear weapons. At least in my view, when I look at this, I think it's important that we draw some distinctions, right? There's some places where these debates are genuinely taking place and they're very serious. I think South Korea is certainly one of them. But there's other places where I think it would be kind of a stretch to call them debates, right? I think in some cases, you might have a couple of politicians kind of ruminating publicly about, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have nuclear weapons? And so I think it's important to kind of draw those distinctions because I'm not sure. And look, I'll be the first to say I'm worried about allied proliferation. I agree with the last panel. I think this is kind of where the primary proliferation threats are emerging. But I'm not sure we have a ton of allies kind of pounding on our door, demanding to develop nuclear weapons. And I think related to that, I think we also want to keep in mind the barriers that exist to nuclear weapons development, right? I think a lot of the allies that we're talking about, I think all of them are members of the NPT, right? So they would have to withdraw from that treaty or, potentially violate it. And there's, domestic constituencies within a lot of these countries that are anti-nuclear weapons that are going to bear on these decisions. I think aside from Japan and maybe Germany through its involvement in Urenco, I don't think any of them have enrichment and reprocessing capabilities, which are obviously kind of the two main pathways to producing material for a bomb. And so, even if they were to desire nuclear weapons, we're looking at, I think, years or decades of a process underway.
But nonetheless, there are some allies, like Japan, like Germany, that could probably go pretty fast. And you brought up in your initial remarks, Eric, that there's a whole set of things that there's a gray area between not having nuclear weapons and having nuclear weapons. It's often talked about in the academic community as like a switch being flipped, but there's an interregnum period that could be very destabilizing. Given the rising, both the rising appeal of friendly proliferation to would-be proliferators and, shifts in U.S. interests, possible shifts in U.S. grand strategy, should the U.S. start to prepare itself for a decision by one of its friends to develop nuclear weapons? Should we make preparations other than just blanket opposition to it?
Well, I would say we should certainly start to think through what the implications of that would be for U.S. interest. But I think related to that, we should also think through how to best prevent it, right? I think it's not, I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification just to say, it's a blanket no, 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 right? As the last panel talked about, I think, the United States has developed kind of one way of dealing with proliferation over the past several decades because the primary proliferation threat has been rogue states, right? Like that's kind of how we kind of all think about proliferation when we think about it. And I think as they kind of argued, and I would agree with it, we've kind of approached this, and I would argue somewhat in a bipartisan way, where the basic strategy is to heap on piles of pressure combined with diplomacy until they decide to sort of choose a different pathway, right? I'm not sure that's really the solution set that's going to work with allies and partners, right? Because you can't, I guess you could maximum pressure an ally, but I don't think that's really the pathway that we would want to go down, nor do I think it's a particularly credible one. So I think there's, and maybe we'll get into this later, I think there's a number of different steps the United States can take to dissuade allies from going down that pathway.
One of the features of this debate is the distinction between particularism and universalism. It strikes me that Jennifer's argument here is that there are particular cases, that there's a particular backdrop to certain regional problems, like in, say, the Baltics or the Korean Peninsula, where the United States might want to make an exception. And given the broader strains on U.S. grand strategy, we have growing resource constraints. We have, rising debate in both of our political parties about first-order issues of what our interests are in the first place. It strikes me that there might be certain cases, and that we have had friendly proliferation in the past. We have 3 close U.S. partners that possess nuclear weapons. This did not lead to a cascade. You might say it didn't lead to a cascade because of all the other policies we put in place to prevent the cascade. But nonetheless, there's there's a certain aspect to the shape of the character of the nine nuclear weapons possessing countries that there are that kind of favors U.S. interests, I think. Like it is better, I think, for U.S. interests than not that there are independent nuclear deterrents in Europe. And I wonder whether that same kind of logic might apply to other places. Jennifer seems to think it does in the case of the Korean Peninsula. Jennifer, you and Daryl Press came up with a very interesting formula for the Baltics, or Poland, which I hope you'll talk about a bit later. But just the idea that thinking in terms of this as a case-by-case problem, which if you look at the history is sort of what we've done in the past, we've made exceptions before, might also make sense in the future. I mean, you write in your article that there were times in the Cold War, in your 2021 Washington Quarterly article, that there were times in the Cold War where we put other interests above friendly non-proliferation and even adversary non-proliferation. Might we do that again?
Question over
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, drawing on that article, I think it's certainly true that in some cases in the Cold War we did put other interests ahead of non-proliferation, right? Look, and in this environment we have a ton of different national security goals, multiple objectives, non-proliferation one of those, and we're going to have to kind of figure out how all of these weave together. But I think I wouldn't quite say that the Cold War was broadly characterized by non-proliferation being put on the back burner and compared to other interests, because again, I think Pakistan is a pretty clear case of where that happened. But you look, if you zoom out, you could argue in many ways the Cold War demonstrated the willingness of the United States and the Soviet Union to actually subjugate competition to cooperation on non-proliferation, right? I think you look at the fact that both were willing to work together to establish the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, work together to form the NPT, basically kind of collude in the shadows to prevent their own allies from developing nuclear weapons. So I think, there's I think a track record of cooperation there. That's not the world we live in today, right? We're in a very different place today. I think there's been some pretty significant backsliding on the part of Russia and certainly China when it comes to non-proliferation practices. Although we, of course, all agree in theory that proliferation is bad, I think we really sort of lack an agreement on what that means in practice. But I don't think that means that we sort of chase them down that pathway, right, of making exceptions to existing rules and policies and standards. And I think, this notion of, controlling for proliferation or sort of selective proliferation, I fear is not, is flawed, right? Because I think, we can certainly all understand why if, South Korea develops nuclear weapons, why it would be hard for us to tell Japan no in that case. But I think really the bigger issue is that if the United States makes the decision to selectively allow proliferation, even in one case, I think that fundamentally, undercuts our role as the kind of the architect and the guarantor of the non-proliferation system that we've developed over time. I think it's going to make it much, much harder to rally the international community to cooperate on preventing any cases of proliferation, even adversary proliferation. I think you've basically, in that case, given Russia and China a green light to do the same with their friends and allies. And I worry, quite honestly, that that could be the unraveling of the NPT, given the role that the United States has played in creating a lot of the norms and standards and institutions that I think have worked quite well to our advantage.
Jennifer, in your early career, you were your work focused on Japanese security policy. You wrote an excellent paper on Japanese buck passing in Japanese security policy. And as I understand it, you have argued that the common argument you hear that Japan would immediately follow a South Korean nuclear breakout isn't that basically we shouldn't take that at face value. Could you talk us through your thoughts about how Japan would react to South Korea getting nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think it's far from an automatic reaction. You've brought up the idea of nuclear cascades, and that is, of course, something that we should be worried about and thinking about. And if there are potential proliferators, we should be thinking about what would be the possible cascades that could follow. In Asia, if we are talking about South Korea perhaps moving to acquire nuclear weapons, then many people do talk about Japan as the domino to fall. I think that there's some reasons for thinking that. Partly that Japan is, of course, observing the same changes in US policy and in the geopolitical environment that South Korea is. And so perhaps it's feeling some of those same pressures. Although I would argue Japan is because of the kind of counter-China orientation of the United States these days, I think Japan is actually in very close stead with the United States, probably more so than any country. So I think actually the alliance relations between the US and Tokyo are quite good. Japan, of course, has the legacy of absorbing 2 nuclear attacks by the United States, which created a very strong anti-nuclear movement within the country. There were also subsequent events such as the Lucky Dragon incident, when US nuclear testing in the South Pacific irradiated Japanese fishermen. There's, of course, the 3/11 disaster in Fukushima. So there's a very strong anti-nuclear sentiment there. On the other end of the spectrum, Japan does have basically many tons of plutonium. It has the engineering capability, the scientific capability, and can be seen in many ways as pretty far down the continuum, at least technically. But again, the Japanese public are so very not interested in this at this moment, which is a very striking contrast with South Korea. And also, I think that the nuclear threat that they face is quite different. North Korea is fundamentally targeting South Korea, and the Japanese do feel a North Korean threat, but definitely not as intently. And so I really do think that this would be a momentous decision for Tokyo. It's not an automatic one, and I think Eric's laid out lots of the reasons why. This is not just like we'll flip a switch and go nuclear. This involves international treaties, domestic politics, complicated industrial and fissile material kit, right? I mean, there's so many considerations here. It's expensive at a time where Japan is already kind of straining to meet the burdens of conventional rearmament. So I think, again, for all of the talk of cascades, we really need to not just identify where the potential cascades might be, but to think through, is it really, do we think that would be in that country's interest? Do we really think that that's a route they would go?
One of the most interesting developments in U.S. foreign policy in the past few years has been our willingness to relax restrictions on transferring nuclear-powered technology to some of our allies. So, for example, the AUKUS Pillar 1 program to transfer nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in the future, and just this past year, the decision by the White House to unclear exactly what we're going to transfer to South Korea, but give them the technology or the permission for them to build nuclear-powered submarines of their own. This has, been noticed in Japan. The Japanese defense minister has said that they're also interested in nuclear-powered submarines. Astrid, this was a section of your recent paper asking about what the U.S. policy community thinks are the motivations for these kind of changes. What have you heard? Does the U.S. policy community think that this is a step back from U.S. non-proliferation commitments, or that there might be some sort of slippery slope? Tell us about your conclusions regarding that.
Thank you. Well, it's one of the questions I asked during the study to understand the perceptions of U.S. experts was how did they interpret the U.S. ROK submarine deal? And I found that there were very different interpretations framing from people who believed it was a very high risk of proliferation because they believed that the deal had a very important nuclear component, to people who believed that it was completely impossible because it was not, it was actually a deal that would be very hard to put into practice, and that they didn't believe it was a threat to the nuclear norm. And my goal was not to find, a decisive answer to this question, but more to understand the perceptions. And so the perception was that the U.S. stance on civil transfer was shallower for these experts, and so it was for allies. But I think it also relates to this grand bargain that we're talking about from the start, this idea that U.S. extended deterrence, and in particular just security guarantees from nuclear weapon states, and that goes also for the U.S., but also the U.K. and France in Europe, for instance, the security guarantees that they provide to their allies and partners are one commitment that is supposed to have a mirroring commitment from the non-nuclear weapon states, which is I will not proliferate, and I will also have access, or in restrictive ways, but access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And I think we see the pieces of the puzzle moving. But maybe one thing I wanted to mention, following what has been said, especially regarding the acuteness and the fact that, discussions in allied countries are dynamic on these issues, but are not revealing an actual intent to go for an indigenous nuclear programs in most cases. In Europe, for instance, the threat of going nuclear used by mostly Poland and Germany, also in Nordic countries, sometimes you have some expert, also a minority, advocating for it. But usually they use it as a bargaining chip to gain more security guarantees from the US, and not actually show that they're willing to go down that perilous route of proliferation, which would be very costly for them. And we've mentioned the cost for the US, but also for allies, it would be very costly to proliferate and to become friendly proliferator. At the military level, for the US, we see this risk of control of escalation in a lot of contingencies. But for allies who don't really have the nuclear literacy, if I may call it like this, it's very dangerous to imagine that they would have to choose how to do, what to do in case of, for instance, a hybrid scenario, or how they would just frame their doctrine. So there's this military unknown that is very dangerous. It would also likely cause entanglement for the US, or deterrence failure in worst case scenarios. In terms of diplomatic and legal issues, it has been mentioned by Eric that it would probably be the end of the NPT if you have this sort of double standard between selective allies and another stance towards adversaries. But also for allies who would be willing to go nuclear, that would probably mean, at least at the beginning, being banned from the international community. And so the reputational costs would be huge. And eventually, in terms of economic terms, you've mentioned it as well before, Jennifer. It's, a lot of allied countries struggle to invest in conventional capabilities that are the ones that they need the most at the moment, in particular, I think in Europe. And so extended deterrence provide known gains for them in terms of stability, while friendly proliferation would likely have, very negative impacts, especially in the window of vulnerability of building up even this moment of hedging that you talked about too, even when they would try to get to this capability. Even those who are advanced, you don't do this overnight. We sometimes hear, oh, now with ChatGPT you can build a nuclear bomb, but it's not true. Like getting to an act, and that's one of the reasons why Iran, didn't get one overnight too. So I think that's also something to put back in the debate, because the questions that it raises for the US are also questions that it raises for allies alike.
Go ahead. So I just wanted to, I think Astrid, you made some really good points there on sort of the conventional forces piece of this, and Jennifer, you as well. And I think, personally, I am all for enabling allied conventional capabilities, right? I think if we're going to say no to nuclear weapons, we have to say yes to conventional capabilities. And so I think I just want to sort of put a marker there. But I think on this notion of civil nuclear energy, I wanted to come back to that for a second, right? I think this is one of those issues where I think there is a significant risk that if we open the door to enrichment and reprocessing in some of these countries who are considering this capability, Saudi Arabia being one of them, South Korea being another, I worry that that's going to be a very difficult door to close. And again, the concern is that those are kind of the key capabilities that countries can use to develop nuclear weapons. And so I think, I do worry about some of the directions that U.S. policy is trending on in this moment. And I also fear, sort of getting back to this, how do we look at the debate taking place within the United States on these issues? I think, I'm not sure everybody quite recognizes the connection of those capabilities to nuclear weapons. I think for some, they sort of say, well, they're our allies. Like, why can't they have them, right? Or why can't we give them all the civil nuclear energy technology? And so I think I worry about the details of what makes nonproliferation work getting lost in some of these broader debates about our relationship with allies.
Are you also worried, in addition to civil nuclear, are you also worried about the military, applications of nuclear reactors to nuclear-powered submarines, for example? Does AUKUS or the South Korea deal?
So, my concern about the submarine deal in the case of South Korea is that, again, based on, I think, some of the reports we've seen, it's an open question whether or not the fuel for that submarine is going to be produced and enriched in South Korea. I think that is the concern there. I'm a little less concerned about AUKUS because it doesn't deal with it in that same way. I will say, on the positive side of civil nuclear energy, I actually do see a significant opportunity for the United States in civil nuclear energy because I think, we're seeing a pretty significant increase in that technology across the world. And I think historically, looking back, the United States used its position in the civil nuclear energy market as a leader in that space to be able to insist on pretty strong nonproliferation conditions in the transfer of those technologies to its partners. And I think there's a strong case to be made that it would be wise to invest in trying to recoup some of that leadership capability in this new interest in nuclear energy and be able to sort of write the new rules of the road, so to speak, when it comes to the nonproliferation, the security conditions around the export of these technologies. And I would add, doing that has benefits not just for nonproliferation, right? That cuts across a variety of different interests. We're talking about how all these interests intersect when it comes to allied proliferation. That has benefits for strategic competition, that has benefits for energy security. And so I think there's a lot of value to be had in pursuing that type of an approach.
Jennifer, one of the strengths of your foreign affairs piece yesterday is that you drew out the extent to which at least some of our current extended deterrence commitments are very dangerous bluffs. And that, at the end of the day, these are promises to put American cities at risk on behalf of a country which is not the United States. For any of you, this is to the whole panel, I guess, whoever wants to jump in first. How do you assess the risks of extended deterrence going forward? Like, are they, obviously we have not had a nuclear war so far, but is Jennifer right that the risks are rising in such a way that not just our allies, but also us should think more urgently about whether an alternative policy framework is needed in order to secure the United States itself? Does anybody want to jump in?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, building on what you said, that is really the core assumption here, which is that the nuclear umbrella, as the title says, is broken, is really strained. So it brings us back to why are we having this conversation today, a conversation that none of us want to have. We don't want our allies to get nuclear weapons. We don't want nuclear weapons to spread. But why is this conversation being kind of put before us, and it's because of the conditions that I mentioned and how they've changed over time. This has led to deterrence being weaker, and so our allies are feeling it, and our adversaries are watching these same trends too. And so if extended deterrence is weakening in these key places at a time when the North Korean threat to South Korea is growing because of strides that they're making in North Korea in their nuclear program, and at a time in Europe when the Russians have grown more aggressive. And so our allies are feeling that they have a increased security threat, a core security threat that is not being met. And so I just wanted to remind us that that's what's in their minds. And so while we'd prefer that they just said everything's fine, ultimately it's not going to be up to us. We can influence things, we have influenced things. But if a country, a sovereign country, decides its core existential security interests are at risk, it's its own decision whether or not it's going to acquire nuclear weapons. So this whole conversation and US foreign policy conversations about this in general tend to say, what do we think about this? Oh, I don't like this. We shouldn't encourage this. But remember, it might not be up to us.
Happy to jump in. I agree with a lot of what Jennifer said, right? I mean, I think, fundamentally, of course, the decision is going to rest in the hands of our allies. I mean, I don't think that means we don't have an interest in trying to shape those decisions and to shape their calculation. And I would completely agree, right? I mean, I share the concerns about, the concerns that allies have about U.S. extended deterrence and about U.S. reliability broadly, I think is where a lot of that concern lies. But I'm not sure, ending extended deterrence is the solution to that problem, right? I think, looking back at some recent examples, I think the Washington Declaration that the United States did, I think it was in 2023, somebody correct me if that's wrong, but under the Biden administration with South Korea, right? I think that potentially shows an example of a useful approach of how to handle these allied concerns, which again, I think are very real, right? In that it set up specific types of mechanisms, specific consultative bodies where the United States and South Korea could come together, share information, do more joint planning, continue to revisit how all of this is working and how all of this is functioning, and to do that in a way that was very strongly rooted in South Korea's commitment not to pursuing nuclear weapons. Is that going to solve South Korea's concerns? Well, has it solved South Korea's concerns? Like totally? Probably not. Is it gonna solve them forever and ever and ever? Of course not. But I think, I'm not sure we can sort of put the task on ourselves to solve those problems forever and ever and ever. They are recurring to various degrees. And so I do think that that's, one example of a type of approach that could potentially help down the road. Of course, those have to be tailored for various situations, as various reasons. I also would say that I don't think we should assume that if allies get nuclear weapons, that our extended deterrence mission would end, right? I don't think that's an assumption we should make. It certainly could. There could be an administration that says, fine, you're on your own. I'm not sure that's going to be the case. And so I'd say, if you don't like the costs of extended deterrence, or if you're skeptical of those costs, I'm not sure allied proliferation is a good solution for those.
Go ahead.
If I may add,
yes.
but if I just 2 sentences, because I agree with what has been said before. But I think also if you take the perspective of allies, it would mean that you trade a proven collective security guarantee for an isolated, contested nuclear capacity that you don't really know how to use. And so that's something also to take into account for allies. I think that's something they have on their mind. But in the recommendation section of my report, one of the things I really tried to do is actually to propose recommendations that are both for the US and the allies to think about this bargain of extended deterrence and non-pro. And in my view, in a lot of allied capitals, this idea of an indigenous program is entertained because they have lost sight of the fact that there is a link between the two still. Even though I agree with what you say, Eric, that could exist maybe in practice, but I think in theory, and to prevent friendly proliferation from happening, I think we should actually have a more like formalized linkage between extended deterrence and non-pro, and being very clear about the fact that the operational viability of extended deterrence, it's like the political commitment, although the technicality also that's around extended deterrence would probably dissolve if an ally, or for the ally who decides to choose the nuclear path. Which is, I think, something that is missing in the conversation now because we took it for granted for a long time because we didn't need to discuss that. But now that there is, a heightened tension on this trade-off, and I think Jennifer's article shows that. I think now we should make it clearer and maybe have, an explicit declaratory policy against friendly proliferation that would show the link between the two, actually.
All right, thank you. We're going to use our last almost 10 minutes for Q&A. We will be taking questions both from online and in person. The online audience may join the conversation and submit questions directly on the event page, Facebook, YouTube, and on X. We have microphones in the room. Please speak clearly and directly into the microphone. Announce your name and affiliation, and please phrase your question in the form of a concise question. Yes, ma'am, right there. Yep.
Thank you for the panel. My name is Maria Razborova. I am a junior at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and my question is about the role of Russian nuclear threat credibility. And so, given that Putin has been repeatedly using nuclear rhetoric, which has mostly seemed to fail in achieving political objectives of deterrence, how does this impact the credibility of Russian nuclear threatening, and how does this in turn impact whether the European allies are seeing this credibility as a reason to proliferate?
All right, effect of Russian nuclear threats on friendly proliferation.
Astrid wants to go.
Astrid.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure if we were taking several questions. That's why I didn't say anything.
Go ahead.
Well, it's definitely, a part of the conversation in Europe, this trying to figure out what were the effects of the Russian rhetoric. But I think one main concern for Europeans is actually that this use of a coercive nuclear rhetoric is what has helped Russia also, try to dissuade the supports of Ukraine during the conflict. It has failed in a lot of instances, but it's still a very effective in particular for public opinions in Europe. And it has actually put the nuclear topic back on the table for a lot of Europeans, and all the debates that we were mentioning previously about indigenous nuclear programs often stem from this fear of Russian nuclear rhetoric, and even sometimes the idea that Russia is acting as an axis with other adversarial powers. It doesn't mean, though, that it's encouraging Europeans to go down that path, because they see the Russian arsenal, they see the balance with the US, and they frame their thinking in terms of we should keep extended deterrence because so far this is what has worked to repel Russian coercive actions and use on the ground. So I think it actually it's actually something that goes in the direction of supporting extended deterrence instead of friendly proliferation.
Yes, sir.
Stephen Snyder. Assuming for the sake of argument that Israel has a nuclear deterrent, how likely is the U.S. to be able to control their use of it? And if the U.S. cannot, what would be the implications with that?
Israeli nuclear deterrent and U.S. foreign policy?
I'll take a stab.
Sure.
So assuming Israel has a nuclear arsenal, I mean, I think, the United States has very low likelihood, I think, of influencing their decision to use that on any given incident. Although I would say, I think one thing that the most recent conflict in the Middle East shows is that when the United States government, when the US president and others weighs in with Israeli leaders, that matters. That does have an influence on their calculation, right? And I would go back to, under the Biden administration, I think the US government's attempts to dissuade Israel from responding more strongly to some of Iran's attacks on Israel, I think that had a role in influencing Israel's calculation. Fast forward to the Trump administration, I also think the perception and ultimately the willingness of Trump to give a green light to Israel to strike Iran also influenced their calculation. So I think there's obviously some opportunity for that influence to happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. This is a great panel. My question is more about the debate surrounding friendly proliferation.
Your name and affiliation?
Oh, sorry. I'm Sahar Khan, and I'm with the Institute of Global Affairs. My question has more to do with if friendly proliferation happens, what kind of procedures would have to take place? All three of you have mentioned, treaties and arrangements, etc. Are we talking about control over the nuclear fuel cycle or fissile material? And say we're in a world where there's an ally that would like to proliferate. How could the US have control over that proliferation? And I mean sort of taking a step beyond the please don't proliferate. Say that, Jennifer, to your point, a sovereign country, if they want to do it, they'll do it. So what kind of actions can the US take over the nuclear fuel cycle to maintain control over that proliferation? Thank you.
Sounds like a question for you.
Happy to jump on that one. Just to clarify, you were saying what steps can the United States take to prevent allied proliferation? Is that, or if it happens?
I guess sort of both. I guess my question is more about fissile material production, because that seems to be the key element, right, in becoming a nuclear weapon state, or at least the first step of it. So I guess my question is, what kind of steps is the US thinking in terms of its allies in these debates that we're having about weakened extended deterrence, and to Astrid's point of perhaps we need more institutionalization of what is extended deterrence and how does it interact with nonproliferation? What kind of, I guess I'm asking you to look in the crystal ball of fissile material production and control.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll tackle the nuclear material production and maybe perhaps expand it a little bit, right? I mean, I think, again, the United States has a set of conditions, right, by law that govern the transfer of civil nuclear technology, right? And those oftentimes contain restrictions on what that country can do with that material with or without US permission. And so that's something that's baked into a lot of agreements, and there's oftentimes where those agreements go further and countries accept additional restrictions on what they can do with that material, and that's obviously been the goal in a lot of cases, right? But we haven't always reached that goal in all of our civil nuclear cooperation agreements. I think, looking a little further down the road, sanctions is obviously a tool that the United States could potentially use to either dissuade an ally or, punish, I guess, right, after the fact that it happens. I think, when we think about sanctions, I think a lot of us think about going back to the last panel, Iran sanctions, right? And we see these sort of the executive orders coming out of the White House. But there's also sanctions that are on the books by law, right, when it comes to nuclear proliferation. And some of those, I think it's the Glenn Amendment and it's the Arms Export Control Act, that would impose some pretty severe consequences on any country, including allies, if they were, for example, to test a nuclear device. Those consequences, they have no waivers, right? There's no waivers to those provisions. So, if you didn't want to enforce those, a new law would presumably have to be passed. So that's, I think, something that would come into play in the future if an ally were to proliferate. And I think, look, when it comes to ally proliferation risks, I think there's a tendency if it's not a severe case, right, if the ally isn't bolting for the bomb, to try to handle this behind the scenes, right, and to try to work things out as best as possible, diplomatically, sort of out of the spotlight. And I think if you look back, right, that was the approach the United States took to South Korea and Taiwan, at least initially in the 1970s and the 1980s. So I think that's, there's a case to be made that that's sort of a preferable pathway, and you only need to go get sort of some of the more public steps or some of the more severe kind of pressure mechanisms if things go in a direction that we don't want. And I would finally add on the civil nuclear energy front, one of the tools that the United States has in the toolkit is that if an ally were to break its commitments to the United States, using US nuclear technology, the United States can request the return of that technology, right? And that would really endanger that country's civil nuclear energy goals.
We are at time, so I'd like to thank Astrid, Jennifer, and Eric for joining us today to talk about this challenging topic. We will now take a 45-minute break for lunch. Please join us back here at 1:05 p.m. For our final panel on U.S. nuclear forces, moderated by Ben Giltner, our policy analyst in our Defense and Foreign Policy Studies program. For those of you in the room, lunch will be served up the spiral staircase in the second floor George Yeager Conference Center. And again, we look forward to seeing you all back here at 1:05. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone had a nice lunch. We're going to go ahead and get started here on our third and final panel. So in our previous two panels, we dealt with U.S. policy towards adversary proliferation, then also friendly proliferation. Now we kind of want to get a little more into the military or nuclear weeds and get into how non-proliferation influences America's nuclear force posture. And in this panel, I want to discuss with all three panelists things like the type of nuclear weapons, the number of nuclear weapons the U.S. should possess, the costs of nuclear weapons, mainly through modernization, how much should the U.S. be willing to pay for these weapons, and then finally the tension between crisis stability and our reassurance to allies, because as Evan and the other panelists brought up at panel 2, the U.S. has this nuclear umbrella to prevent other countries from getting nuclear weapons, to preventing our allies from getting these nuclear weapons. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce all our panelists here. We'll start off with Dr. Austin Long. Austin is a senior nuclear fellow at MIT's Center for Nuclear Security Policy and a leading scholar of nuclear strategy and deterrence. He previously served in senior positions on the Joint Staff, was a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, and an associate professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Austin's work has appeared in well-renowned spaces like International Security, the Journal of Strategic Studies, the Texas National Security Review, and many others. He's also the author of the book, The Soul of Armies, Counterinsurgency Doctrine and Military Culture in the United States and the United Kingdom. He's also co-edited the book, Managing U.S. Nuclear Operations in the 21st Century. Austin received his BS from the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech and a PhD in political science from MIT. We then have John Wolfstall, who is a fellow for U.S. nuclear policy at Pax Sapiens and serves on the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And up until May 2025, he was the member of the U.S. Department of State's International Security Advisory Board. Prior to Pax Sapiens, he was the director of global risk at the Federation of American Scientists. He previously served as special assistant to President Obama for national security affairs and as senior director for arms control and non-proliferation at the National Security Council. John is the co-author of the book, Deadly Arsenals, Tracking Weapons of Mass Destruction, and he has authored numerous op-eds and articles on nuclear weapons policy. John received his BA in political science from Emory University. And then we have Mallory Stewart, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Council on Strategic Risks and a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. She has also served as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Affairs. From 2022 to 2025, Mallory served as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability at the U.S. Department of State, where she oversaw U.S. policy on nuclear arms control, risk, and reduction. Mallory served as a Special Assistant to President Biden and a Senior Director for Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council. She holds a BA from Harvard College and a JD from Stanford Law School. And with that, thank you all for being here. I greatly appreciate it. So I like to kind of go in the order that introduced you all, so I'll address the first question to Austin. And this one kind of just gets to the, heart, I guess, of this panel. But what would you say is the relationship between U.S. non-proliferation goals and its force posture? And if you could, I know at some point in this panel, it's probably going to be brought up, but just for our audience, could you briefly define what damage limitation is? Because that more or less is what our nuclear strategy is as of now.
That's certainly a piece of it. So in the last panel, I think, was very good on this. Yep. The relationship between U.S. nuclear force posture and non-proliferation objectives is really this question of extending deterrence to allies, right? It's part of the set of agreements, both tacit and formal, that underpin all of the non-proliferation objectives that I think the last panel talked to quite well. And so you heard, I think, from Jenny Lind, this point about how credible is it that the United States will put its own cities, its own homeland at risk for allies. And part of how we've designed our force structure over the decades is to make that promise to an extent. It's not really a promise in the sense of a guarantee, but it's a commitment. Commitment to allies credible. And so that involves not just the ability to use nuclear weapons in a limited fashion, which we developed in the 60s, 70s, and beyond, but also the ability to hold adversary nuclear arsenals at risk to be able to limit the damage that adversaries can inflict to the United States. And that's been a variable over time. Early in the Cold War, it was pretty clear we had a huge advantage in the ability to limit damage to the United States. Certainly that was the view of a lot of the decision makers during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That changed over time. But that objective of being able to limit damage to the United States and its allies, it's not just our own cities we're trying to limit damage to, has been a major component of U.S. nuclear strategy. But again, not the only element.
John or Mallory, would you like to share your input or thoughts on this?
Yeah, maybe just to broaden the frame a little bit, there's been a lot of consistency in the formal U.S. nuclear strategy dating back multiple presidents, dating back easily through, I would say, Johnson, probably even before that. That the United States has nuclear weapons for three reasons: to deter enemy attack against us or our allies or our strategic interests, to reassure our allies, and if deterrence were to fail, to limit the damage that could be done to the United States and its allies and interests. And the question then becomes one of, are these goals all possible in parallel, or are there tension between them? And I think what you're seeing, and I'll suggest we're here, I should say thank you for having us here, but we're here in part because there is a new debate that is engaged about the extent to which the United States needs to add nuclear weapons to its arsenal in order to be able to improve its ability to limit damage to the United States and our allies as a goal in and of itself, that is important to deter, that is important to reassure. And there are debates about that, and there are trade-offs between the ability to do that and whether or not you are participating in fueling or responding appropriately or inappropriately to the risk of arms race instability, of crisis management. Those are all, I think, very reasonable debates and discussions to be having, but one that, quite frankly, the United States hasn't had for 30 plus years. Most of the people that are engaged in them read about them in the history books, and we probably need to brush off our understanding and appreciation for how we managed these things in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that the panelists has said is completely correct. The question really is how we go forward in an arena in which some of the fundamental assumptions that we've had for decades are shifting, right? There's some changes in our closest alliances. There's some changes in the reliance on international law in so many of our global and diplomatic settings. And so, definitely agreeing with John that there's been more commonality than difference in our nuclear policy over the past several decades. Is there a reason to change now? Is there a motivation to change now? Is it credible to take a different approach given the changing that we see in the international order? Or do we stay the course and try to minimize some of the drivers of instability, such as arms racing and other necessary results from certain nuclear policies? And I think that's an open question that we should be talking about. I'm glad we are on this panel.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I definitely want to get into arms control and arms racing, because that is very much connected to our panel today. But first, John, you brought up numbers. I'd like to get your thoughts, and also Austin and Mallory's thoughts on this. But currently, the U.S. has about 3,700 nuclear warheads in total. About 1,770 of those are deployed. I guess a question that everyone wants to know is how much is enough. It's the classic question from the Cold War and up till now. So how much do you say is enough? Like, obviously can't give an exact number on this, but there's debates generally if the U.S. needs more or less, keep about the same. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Again, it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. And so there's nothing magical about the number or a particular number, unless you're McNamara, in which case you like nice round numbers. It's an old nuclear joke, sorry. So we have roughly 1,700 nuclear weapons, and I don't think there's anybody who doubts, or let me put it positively, no one believes that Russia or China is about to embark on a major military attack on the United States or its allies because they doubt our physical capability to respond and to destroy them with nuclear weapons. So in that sense, we have plenty of nuclear weapons to deter. Now, the question is, do you have enough nuclear weapons to reassure our allies? I would argue, not being a big fan of the current administration's approach, that in my mathematical expertise, I've put forward the calculation that deterrence equals capability times credibility. And if either capability or credibility is zero, deterrence is zero. Right now, our credibility for our allies and deterring our adversaries is as close to zero as you can get until you know it's zero. So it wouldn't matter to me if we doubled our nuclear weapons. We're not going to increase our credibility to our allies or our adversaries based on numbers. I think you can do things with conventional weapons. I think you can do things with alliance management. But I don't think there's anything numerically you can or need to be doing right now to reassure. The question then, I think, gets to this issue of, is damage limitation a necessity for reassuring or for deterring? I think there's some evidence that our adversaries do really care about those calculations. I think there's also a lot of evidence that says right now we're fully capable of handling the entirety of the Russian nuclear and strategic complex with the arsenal we have. There's more than enough to handle the Chinese nuclear complex and strategic complex. The question is, do we need to cover both Russia and China simultaneously? There's a lot of debate about that. I don't see anything in the nature of the Chinese and Russian relationship that amounts to a joint suicide pact. But planners it is their job to think, if we have a war with both, do we have enough nuclear weapons to cover both? And then the question becomes, if the answer is no, what is the consequence of building more in terms of the amount of money, in terms of slowing down the already existing modernization programs that we've decided are in our interest, like the submarine program, like the bomber program, and what does it mean in terms of our ability to provide the other forms of reassurance? Our economic power and vitality is a big part of our alliance management and reassurance policy. So that's a cop-out to say I can't give you an answer. I currently don't support adding more nuclear weapons to the U.S. arsenal. I don't think that would be where my priority is. My priority is let's do the things we've committed to that we say are important on submarines, on bombers. The ICBM, I think, we've obviously found wiggle room Because the modernization program is taking a lot longer, we can maintain our ICBMs in current force longer than we previously thought. I'd rather do those things well and modernize our conventional capability before I would prioritize more nuclear weapons. And I've gone on too long, but I'll just say a point about that. The previous panel talked about the consequence of the Iran war. One of the things we've realized is that we don't have the conventional munitions, either offensively or defensively, to fight a small war in Iran and be able to handle our defense commitments in Europe or in Asia Pacific. If we can't do that, then no amount of nuclear modernization is going to matter, because we've got to be able to conventionally reassure and conventionally deter before we get into the nuclear calculation. And so if we've got extra dollars to spend, let's increase our defense production on interceptors. Let's increase our defense production on munitions that are most likely going to be the capabilities that reassure our allies and deter our adversaries.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, which is that the U.S. has this damage limitation strategy to reassure its allies, and it seems like you're questioning that to some degree. Correct me.
Yeah, no, I don't question. We clearly go to our allies and have these conversations and say, don't worry, if things go horribly wrong, we will blow that country off the face of the map, and you don't have to worry about it. And they say, well, will a couple get through? And we have to say, well, okay, a couple might get through, but we're building missile defense. We're going to do everything we can. There is no absolute state of reassurance. One of the areas where people think we disagree, and I actually think most people, reasonable people, do agree, is we want to reassure our allies so they don't need to build nuclear weapons, and so they remain closely aligned with the United States. We're looking for ways to do that. Sometimes we do that with the defense community and say, don't worry, we're going to have these defense capabilities for you. Sometimes we talk to the nuclear community and say, don't worry, we're going to have these nuclear capabilities. Most of the time we're talking to the politicians and the alliance managers and say, don't worry, we're with you no matter what. And then of course, all of our businesses are saying, well, we couldn't live without you if we tried, right? We're all in on South Korea because you make most of our chips. We're all in on you, Saudi Arabia, because, Europe needs your oil. Like, we demonstrate that. So I don't think it's a question of whether I support it or don't. It is a factor, but there are lots of factors, and how they all balance each other is how policy gets made.
To that point, Austin, I'd like to pose this question to you, but John kind of brought this up in that, with our reassurance to allies, this can, to some degree, create instability with our adversaries, where, with things like a damage limitation strategy, they might be, more willing to launch on warning during a crisis, or at the very least be more on edge. So my question to you is that, is there a way that the United States can reassure its allies and attempt to the best of its ability maintain this crisis stability? Is there a way to balance both of them?
I think there is conceptually. It's really hard in practice. So if you look at some of the work in the late Cold War, some of which is actually done by scholars affiliated with Cato, but also with the RAND Corporation, there is a trade-off between instability. Adversaries believe you might use nuclear weapons first, and perhaps even on a large scale, and their fear to attack in this sort of strange Levian sense, right? You want them to have some discomfort. You don't want perfect stability where they think there's no chance the United States will ever use nuclear weapons first, because then that creates a sort of world in which they feel like they can create all sorts of mischief, this sort of stability and instability paradox. And mischief in this case, we were worried in the Cold War, could include a conventional invasion of Western Europe. So this is perfect stability, probably not good for extended deterrence. Perfect instability, for reasons you've articulated, that an adversary feels like, for whatever reason, they have to use nuclear weapons first, and probably on a large scale very early in a crisis. That's probably not good either. There's probably a sweet spot. Conceptually, there clearly is a sweet spot, this idea of optimum instability, enough that an adversary doesn't feel pressure to use early and large in a crisis, but at the same time, discomforting enough to them that they actually will not even initiate a crisis. So this isn't even about shaping crisis alone, it's about keeping adversaries from even doing anything to enter into a crisis. So conceptually, that's the sort of point you want to reach. And the US has done a lot to shape its force structure in ways to sort of create this optimum instability. Most of our nuclear forces, certainly day to day, are in a survivable mode, right? We have ICBMs that potentially are not survivable in a large-scale attack, but we keep lots of boats at sea. If we generate in a crisis, we have more boats at sea. Most of our capability, certainly in the current configuration, lives in a mode that doesn't invite adversary attacks. So we've done a lot in terms of our force structure to try and get to that point. Whether we've succeeded or not is maybe a different question.
Yeah, to loop back to, and keeping in line with kind of this crisis instability, we also get the question of arms control, which I'd like to pose to Mallory, because one thing that gets overlooked in the non-proliferation treaty, which again, this is all tied in with this conference, is that Article 6 aims to have nuclear armed countries at the very least pursue arms control, preferably disarm. Mallory, obviously that's not happening, at least as of late. We have New START that expired, as well as the INF treaty. So my question to you is, to what degree, or would you say that U.S. nuclear strategy and doctrine is an obstacle to achieving arms control and achieving, this Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Because this is a point that countries like Iran and others are, continue to bring up. Well, why should we, not pursue the bomb when the U.S., continues to build up and maintain its arsenal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Going back to the earlier conversation, since we have so much consistency in our nuclear policy, and yet with that consistency, we've been able to engage in arms control discussions. I don't think the nuclear policy alone is either limiting those arms control discussions or promoting those arms control discussions necessarily. It often comes down to the politics, the diplomacy efforts, the policies of the particular administrations, what the perception of risk and threat is between the countries. Certainly having, the shelling balance between adequate deterrence and defense capacities to drive potential adversaries to the negotiating table is a necessary aspect. And that's why I think even in this morning's conversation, you have that shelling balance of arms control and defense and deterrence to be able to go forward with these principles. But given, again, the stated nuclear policy, and I will say there hasn't been a new NPR, but nuclear posture review, but the NPRs through the previous several administrations have been fairly consistent. I don't think the nuclear policy itself limits arms control. I just think there has to be an engagement in the obligations that we all committed to under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there has to be a commitment to understanding why risk reduction, arms control, and non-proliferation are in our own national security interests. And I think that's where you see the up and down. You see the up and down in the engagement in an arms control discussion, or maybe just a risk reduction discussion in general. Can we reduce the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation before we even get to an arms control point? Can we at least try to stabilize some of the miscalculation potential between ourselves and our greatest adversaries? And that's where you see the up and down motivation for arms control. Certain administrations appreciating the value of that risk reduction, and other administrations thinking that the benefit of a deterrence a model that doesn't include risk reduction as some of its strength as a benefit versus pursuing some risk reduction in that deterrence context. And I think that's the up and down we've seen. I think that's the up and down we'll continue to see. And I think a large part of this does rely on where our allies are, where they feel comfortable, and where our adversaries are rattling chains, and where we ourselves potentially are going forward with chain rattling in some of the deterrence posturing.
If I can just add on here, I think an observation that keeps coming back to my mind. I've been doing this now since the mid-1980s, and I think the biggest change has been there was a recognition among the old guard that I came up under that worked through the 1940s and 50s and 60s that these things were integrated with each other. Nuclear strategy, deterrence, reassurance, arms control, risk reduction were all part of the same process to achieve a stable world where the United States could manage its relationships, prosper, and win, right? Win the Cold War, win the economic battle, the competition of models for governance. Over really since the late 1990s, even though there are intellectual arguments, and it's not like they all got along in the 50s, they all argued and then had martinis, you now have these camps. And the camps don't believe the other side are relevant. You don't need deterrence anymore. All you need is arms control. You can't do arms control unless it's multilateral or unless we have the conditions where we can dominate. And in fact, the world doesn't work that way. Presidents don't think that way. Leading politicians shouldn't think that way. What are you trying to achieve? You're trying to create a condition of stability and deterrence so that you can go about the business of America, which is often business. And other people would say other things as well. Pick your choice. Democracy promotion, whatever. But until you agree that you've got these different tools and that they all work in different contexts and you use them well, you're really operating with one arm tied behind your back. And I think that's the challenge we see today where, when I tell my students that most often in the intellectual debates in the 1970s and 1980s, the Defense Department and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency were unified in support of arms control measures, and the State Department was opposed, along with parts of the White House. They're like, what do you mean? Like, first of all, it was the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. They don't remember what that was. And they're like, why would DOD support arms control? And it's because it was a way of achieving limitations on your adversary without having to go to war with them. And it was able to avoid some of the things that drove instability. Now, in the trenches, most people get that, and Austin and I and Mallory have worked together, and we can do that pretty well. But intellectually and ideologically, we're being forced to these extremes, which I think make it harder for us to make good policy.
And I would just two-finger on that, because I absolutely agree. I think the acknowledgement of risk reduction, all things risk reduction, being a crucial part of a balanced deterrence approach that protects ourselves and our allies has been lost somewhere, but it kind of rides along with a diminishment in appreciation for diplomacy, a diminishment in appreciation for multilateralism. And I think, unfortunately, even international law is declining in some of the policy approaches that disfavor risk reduction, diplomacy, and arms control. And I think that's unfortunate because for many, many decades, that element of diplomacy, multilateralism, risk reduction, arms control, and non-proliferation was seen as crucial to maintaining national security equivalent to our defense capacities.
Yeah, with John, I'm glad you brought up the 1980s because I have a question related to that, and this is just to the general panel, and it also deals with this arms control issue, but there's obviously the Trump administration's Golden Dome. I guess my question for you all is, how is this driving, or maybe not driving, but contributing to uneasiness or some instability among our adversaries? Because both Russia and China have expressed some concerns about this. The Congressional Budget Office put out an estimate that this is going to cost like over $1 trillion, I believe, within next couple years. So, what are your all thoughts on this?
Oh, everybody's going to look at me?
No.
Okay.
I'm just taking up all the oxygen I thought I'd share.
Look, a lot depends. I mean, you referenced the 80s. We had the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s. That certainly created unease in the Soviets, but not panic. So, I mean, I think it's a set of capabilities that, we have some limited national missile defense today. We've had some for 20 years now. In terms of cost, a lot depends on what we actually deploy, how we deploy it, et cetera. So I think if the general question is, should strategic defenses as well as strategic offensive capabilities be part of the mix of tools, to John's point, that the United States has, I think absolutely. Beyond that, you get into the eaches of where's your best investment, et cetera. But it does not discomfort me that our adversaries are uneasy about our capabilities. I think that's a positive good for deterrence. The question is, how uneasy? What complications does that create? Is there a better tool? How does it work with other tools? Those are, I think, the important questions.
Yeah, look, I don't think China is increasing the number of nuclear weapons that it has because they're worried about Golden Dome. I think they're worried that they want to have the ability to have, at the minimum, a second strike retaliatory capability so that the United States can't coerce them or attack them, and they would lose their deterrent. Will Golden Dome make that situation better or worse? I think it's likely to tell the Chinese, whatever we're building to may not be enough, and we need to keep those production lines hot, and if necessary, we need to keep building up, which then complicates the challenge of damage limitation, which then says, okay, well, we are in an arms race. You know, they're going to keep building up. We need to build up in order to cover our damage limitation strategy. Golden Dome is never going to be highly effective or cost effective at the margins in dealing with conventional, ballistic missile threats. And even if it were, there are lots of unconventional delivery means that adversaries can use. So it's not a wise investment in my belief. I think we should be investing in point defenses, regional defenses, mobile defenses. I think there are lots of things you can do that help improve our defense operational strategy. But we just have to recognize that these things are not cost-free in terms of the dynamic. Now, if we don't care about arms racing, if money is no object, if the consensus is we shouldn't live in a world where China or Russia have second strike retaliatory capabilities, that's no longer necessary for deterrence, then, okay, fine, let's have that conversation. But I think that's one of the challenges that we moved away from is, while we never all agreed that it was a good thing, we recognized that there was a situation where we couldn't disarm Russia and they couldn't disarm us, and that contributed to us neither side attacking each other. Is that the basis for security going forward? Some people would say it, whether we like it or not, it is. Some people say, I don't like it, I want to change that. But there are real implications for those two answers, and we haven't done a very good job in the public policy discourse about what they mean.
I also think we have to go into Golden Dome sort of eyes wide open, which is we will drive our potential adversaries to those new and novel capabilities that won't be able to be easily addressed by what we already have proposed in the Golden Dome architecture, right? Realizing there's still an open question as to interceptors, as to sort of which capacities we'll be able to roll forward with based on money or physics or any other reason. But certainly putting Golden Dome out there will encourage future planners from potential adversaries to say, okay, let's go undersea, let's go hypersonic, let's go drone to a maximum degree, those kind of capabilities that are harder for us to deal with in a Golden Dome context. That said, I think Golden Dome is a response to a feeling that the US government has had for some time that Russia has gone forward with these super weapons, these new and novel nuclear capabilities undersea, nuclear-powered, nuclear weapon hypersonics. We've seen all of these avant-garde and Poseidon tests that Russia has done of these new and novel capabilities, and the US has not done any new and novel nuclear development for some time. So there's been a feeling, both in the defense arena, but also more broadly, that the US has been trying to stay the course, to sort of keep within its traditional model of nuclear policy, to stay sort of with its existing arsenal while first, China is building up, but second, Russia is going to all of these novel capabilities. And that really drove in large part a thinking that we need more to defend ourselves. And Golden Dome, brought together a lot of the policies of previous administrations to have our missile defense capacities talk to each other, to be able to more systematically utilize our missile defense coherently across both the United States and our allies and partners in a way that makes more sense than just individual systems, the way it was originally developed. And I don't think that's wrong, but I think it does lead to the need for a conversation with China and Russia to explain why Golden Dome was deemed necessary, why Golden Dome is supported right now in the United States, because there's no other way to really try to feel secure in the face of novel and nuclear development of weapon systems by Russia and a advancement of exponential increase in China's nuclear arsenal. So, I think Golden Dome is a perfect conversation to have if we are going to talk about what a potential risk reduction conversation would look like with Russia and China, not necessarily to restrict ourselves, but at least to explain why we deemed it necessary. And I would just note that Russia and China are complaining about Golden Dome, but Russia is now saying, isn't it good we have these super weapons because of Golden Dome, which is ironic because they developed the super weapons, the ideas for before Golden Dome was even announced, right? The blaming on missile defense of all things development in either Russia or China is somewhat questioned if it's just Golden Dome itself, because they always blame missile defense and they always kind of push forward with a need for additional arsenals as a result of our defensive capacities.
But I think there is good evidence that the decision by President Putin to invest a lot of money in these novel delivery systems, Poseidon, Skyfall, were driven by the U.S. decision to withdraw from the ABM treaty.
Yes.
And he said, okay, well, ballistic missiles are no longer going to be the vehicle by which we have an assured destructive capability. I need to do these things that are less vulnerable to interception by what missile defense might be.
Absolutely.
So just because they say it doesn't mean that it's inaccurate.
No, I think missile defense is one of the drivers for all of the new and novel capabilities that we've seen, and I think Golden Dome will just exacerbate that. Completely agree. I just think Golden Dome as a political concept itself was not the driver for these new and novel, but it's just going to be added to the list of reasons that they feel they need to continue this going forward.
I will note that those capabilities are not necessarily a wise use of their money. So when you think about arms races and costs at the margin, there are lots of costs at the margin, and some favor us and some may not.
Yeah, on that point, what would you all say is like the right investment for the United States? Like obviously, modernization was brought up. That's going to, I think CBO put out it'll cost over $1 trillion over next decade. What do you all see as like, should the U.S. prioritize certain things? There's also debate about whether or not ICBMs should be kept, or whether we should upgrade to the Sentinel systems, which is already having a host of issues already. What are your all thoughts on this?
Yeah, maybe I'll set the frame and then let the panelists sort of weigh in. So under the terms of the New START Treaty, President Obama committed to the Senate that he would and the administration would modernize or update all legs of the triad, submarines, bombers, and ICBMs. That grew into something known in the community as the program of record. So we're going to build the new Columbia-class submarine, we're going to build the new B-21, and we're going to build the new Sentinel. In 2014, when I was out of government, we did the first study at the Monterey Institute, which said that's going to cost $1 trillion over 30 years. And people said, oh, you're an extremist, that's an exaggeration. Then CBO came out a couple of years ago and said, no, it's going to be $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And everybody recognized that this was a massive undertaking. Whether you believed it was necessary or important, it was what the body politic, Congress, administrations had agreed was necessary to maintain our deterrent. We had recommended at the time that you actually stagger those systems. Instead of pursuing all three at the same time, you could avoid the strain on the defense industrial base and actually have a better odds of success than if you pursued them all at once, because we worried about unilateral disarmament by default. And in fact, what we are seeing is a Sentinel program which is having many more problems because it was rushed to decision under the first Trump administration. We've seen the submarine program actually get up ahead of steam, and the bomber program, even though it's unnecessarily classified, make pretty good marks and seems to be doing okay, but we don't really know what the costs are. I think there's still broad consensus that the United States will and should maintain all three legs of the triad. In this environment, that still has pretty broad consensus. Where it begins to break down are things like, well, should you go at breakneck speed for Sentinel no matter what? Or can you in fact rely on life extending the Minuteman older systems for another 10 or 15 years, if technically feasible? Could you manage, say, fewer Minutemen, but with more warheads on each missile so you can maintain roughly the same numbers and give the Sentinel program time to actually be fixed, if it's fixable? And that's a big question. Where that consensus breaks down are on these new systems. Do we need a sea-launched cruise missile? Trump said yes, Biden said no, Trump says yes, but now Trump isn't actually pursuing it at breakneck speed because there are other things they want to do. So it's not clear, and I think there's some debate on how important it is, but there's a debate there, and we should continue that discussion. Do we need brand new follow-on systems that are being contemplated? I think, again, that's where the consensus breaks down, but it should be driven by what you think is necessary for deterrence, and reassurance, and if damage limitation should be a driver. And if you don't have consensus there, then you don't have consensus on what to do. Now, do you need consensus? Sometimes you go without it. But I think what we have seen is opportunism, where an administration gets into power and they drive decisions through a process that's inconsistent with what we've built up over decades to ensure accountability, financial management, delivery on time, and the results are predictable. You have programs that are massively over budget that aren't going to fill our defense commitments and that drain the coffers of money that we need for other things.
I'll just note that it was the Congress that gave us the nuclear sea launch cruise missile back, not the Trump administration part two. It was the Congress and the Biden administration. So to your point about consensus, there was at least sufficient consensus in the Congress to restore that. Now, to your other point, whether that consensus endures or we have other priorities now is a different question. But it wasn't just administration changing. It was congressional, fairly unusual congressional endorsement. I think John's framing is basically right. A lot of the additional expenditures, if you wanted a larger nuclear force, will be outside that decade window because our industrial base is going to be limited in producing big systems. I mean, we're producing submarines about as fast as we can right now, absent opening another shipyard or something like that, and even that would take a long time. So, I mean, there's only so much we can do in the immediate near term. The question is, what should the goal be? How should you manage modernization versus keeping older systems going, et cetera? There's a lot of questions there. I will note, $1 trillion, that's a lot of money. Even for Elon Musk, that's a lot of money. But if you really want to save money, that comes out of the conventional forces budget because the $1 trillion figure you quote is about 10% of what DoD will spend, maybe 12% depending on what we think budgets will be over the next decade. The other 80-odd%, wherever that ends up being, are for conventional forces. So, nuclear weapons are, relatively speaking, your best economic bet. They have, not as much versatility in some cases as conventional forces do, but they are relatively, again, relative does a lot of work in that statement, inexpensive.
I think we should also sort of parse a little bit the semantic argument that modernization somehow includes new types, right? The interesting thing to me about China's buildup is that they're calling it their own modernization, right? And our modernization concept is ensuring a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal, which everyone presumably would want. You don't want your nuclear arsenal to be easily hacked. You don't want your nuclear arsenal to fail miserably. You don't want to have accidents and resulting nuclear disasters because you haven't modernized. You haven't kept your systems up to par with the standards that are required in today's technological environment, versus what China and Russia can argue, and Russia has said this as well, modernization for them includes these novel nuclear super weapons in Russia, includes the exponential increase in a nuclear arsenal, and that's very different, right? I think the Obama administration, certainly in negotiating for the New START treaty, understood that modernizing the nuclear arsenal meant keeping it up to today's safety, security, and effectiveness standards. It didn't mean new and novel types of nuclear weapons. And I think that's an important difference because we hear this word modernization tossed around. I've even seen sort of the nuclear opponents argue that modernization is a bad thing. And that confuses me because we all want a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal if we have to have a nuclear arsenal, which in today's environment, the consensus is we do, not just for ourselves, but for our allies. So, I think the question is, in the trade-off that Austin mentioned, yes, the nuclear program may be 10% of our conventional, but our conventional is also struggling, as we saw in, again, an Iran war that Trump began, which didn't necessarily come to a positive winning conclusion, right? And so even if you're arguing that it's just 10% of that conventional capacity, is that a trade-off that we should discuss a little bit more before we start new nuclear weapons programs, before we commit to new and novel variants of our traditional nuclear arsenal that is being appropriately modernized but doesn't necessarily have to include these new and novel variants?
Let's see, we have about 20 minutes left. We'll go ahead and go into Q&A unless anyone has anything further to add at the moment. Okay. If you're online, please submit them through either the events webpage, Facebook, YouTube, or on X. For those in the audience, please speak clearly into the microphone. Try to keep questions short if you can and in the form of a question. And we'll go ahead and get started. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you, Carl Polzer, Center on Capital and Social Equity. So my question has to do with the move from a two-player game of mutual assured destruction. It used to be just us and the Soviets. So if you blow me up, I'll blow you up, and it still almost happened. But now we have a multiplayer game. Maybe 3 main players and about 10 side players. Some are in alliances, some are independent, some are overlapping. So the question is, how do you manage that? It seems to me we're less secure because there's more of a chance of surprise attack. There's, deception. And if you only have an hour or two to respond, and you only had one red phone before, now you maybe have like 20 colors. So how do you manage that? In real time. And then maybe you have a president that's on TV, maybe, how do you manage that? Maybe we have to do more in the communications. Anyhow, that's the question. Thanks. Thanks for your discussion.
Do you want to take more questions?
Sure, yeah, we'll take another question. Yes, in the front, middle.
Hi, my name's Ashita. Thank you so much for being here. You guys talked a little bit about Golden Dome. Could you please touch on how other countries might start taking their capabilities to space and what the nuclear domain intersected with the space domain looks like or will look like, and what security risks we can expect?
I was going to have you take the first question, but I think you got to take the second one.
Sure, you can do both if you want. Certainly to your question, I do think enhanced communication, preventing risks of misunderstanding and miscalculation is something that we need at all times, but even more so in a multilateral environment where we have multipolarity on sort of arms racing, but also potential threat and threat perceptions. That doesn't solve the problem. It does become that much more complicated. I think one of the reasons that our deterrence analysis and our national security community has to constantly evolve is to take into account the multipolarity we're now facing, the fact that there are so many more potential sources of both nuclear and conventional attack, and what we can put in place to strengthen our own security and that of our allies, including what international laws we negotiated, what normative processes we ourselves promoted because we saw it in our interest, and whether we need to preserve them more adamantly to feel that we understand what's coming, to preserve a certain amount of transparency and predictability, and again, to prevent misunderstanding and miscalculation. And I can go into some examples if you want, but I do want to jump to your question because I think it's really important. We've seen with the allegation of the US government under the previous administration in 2024, a deep and serious concern about Russia placing a nuclear weapon in orbit around the Earth in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And I mentioned the Outer Space Treaty because, again, this is one of the treaties we negotiated that we strongly believed was in our own interest. But we negotiated at a time before there was technical capability to verify much of the parameters. And Article 4 of that Outer Space Treaty says that any WMD is prohibited from being placed in orbit around the Earth or in celestial bodies. But this would be a clear-cut and direct violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And so where does Russia want to go with that? Are they going to continue developing this program covertly and then potentially utilize it in violation of the Outer Space Treaty as an end game in a conflict? Are they just developing it as a threat they can hold over us? What is the intent? And I think that there's a lot of confusion on that. But certainly there's a recognition of the importance of outer space to our national security, to global stability, to financial markets, to all forms of daily life, both in our country and almost in every country around the world. So it's very much a end game kind of weapon system that we should try to understand. I would argue that we strengthen the treaties that we put in place to try to prevent these kind of developments. And the Outer Space Treaty is a perfect example of something negotiated 60 years ago that now we have the capacity to verify. We didn't build in a verification provision, but maybe now through a practice of the parties or through all the ongoing open-ended working groups in which they're discussing the prevention of arms race in outer space, maybe we can start talking about verification capacities to strengthen that treaty and to show attribution toward anyone that would violate it and hopefully hold them accountable. But as we see international law diminish, the likelihood of strengthening treaties, the likelihood of attribution and accountability under treaties itself is also diminishing. And so then you face the additional challenge, then do we have to prepare and harden ourselves against nuclear attack in space? And I think we should be hardening our satellites. We should be developing capabilities to persist and be resilient through such an attack. But it's very hard for those countries that don't have the capacity or resource to do that with their satellites to be able to maintain that resilience. So it's an open question. I think one of the approaches should be strengthening international architectures that have kept us safe, and another should be preparing ourselves to be more resilient and to be able to outlast such a novel use of nuclear weapon in outer space.
I agree with Mallory generally, particularly on that last point about the need for hardening and resilience. But you ask questions about stability. I mean, there's nothing more destabilizing than a nuclear weapon in space because it is both vulnerable to preemption. This is part of why we believe the Russians were going to keep it secret. It's vulnerable to preemption. Yes, it is the doomsday machine. I see you snickering over there.
Not at all.
And so this is the question about stability. It's not just up to the United States to decide whether stability prevails in relationships. This is a capability that genuinely invites preemption, but is quite powerful if it's used. It's exactly the kind of thing that brings up questions about crisis stability, much more so than U.S. nuclear force posture.
For me, this is a question on both fronts, both on crisis communication, but also on this action-reaction cycle of nukes in space, missile defenses in space. We have a responsibility to be strategic, to think about, okay, what might happen and how would you like to avert that? It's likely, possible, inevitable, we will come into some sort of conflict with Russia and or China, unintended, accidental, or intentional. It would be a good thing if we had the means to communicate with each other in real time without having to rely on Verizon. And so let's put those things in place now. Yes, they're hard to do, and yes, there's a lot of work, and sometimes the Chinese don't want to cooperate, and sometimes the Russians don't want to cooperate, but it's time worth spent. On Golden Dome, here's the scenario. We're going to build a network of thousands of space-based interceptors to try to intercept one nuclear weapon, potentially coming from an adversary, that's going to land on the United States. And so we think we can intercept that. And our adversary isn't going to take a nuclear weapon and blow it up in space to blow a giant hole in those interceptors so that they can then follow through with another nuclear weapon through that exact hole to hit us. That's not very strategic. And it gets to the point of where Golden Dome came from. It came out of Donald Trump's head. And that is not where strategy comes from. We all have to interpret what presidents say and try to make strategy out of it. And we have a feedback loop to do that. But Golden Dome is not a wise investment. What is a wise investment, and I think you've got consensus here on this panel at least, if you think you are vulnerable in space because you rely on space-based battle management, communications for all sorts of things, have the ability to quickly put up low Earth orbit satellites to replace if you lose them. And that removes the incentive on your adversary to attack you in space. That's been legislated for the last 20 years, and we haven't built it. And Elon Musk, for all of his ills, has provided a capability to do that quickly. We should be doing that in a very aggressive way to remove the incentive to attack. But that's where we're supposed to be doing our jobs and where the administration is actually supposed to be imposing good policy. We're just not in that world right now.
Let's take some more questions. Yes, Sahar.
Hi, I'm Sahar Khan with the Institute of Global Affairs. Keeping in mind that U.S. foreign bases don't house nuclear weapons, but are considered essential for U.S. extended deterrence, what lesson does the damage to U.S. bases in the Gulf offer to U.S. force posture and extended deterrence? And this is for all three of you. Thanks.
I'm no longer with the Federation of American Scientists, but when I was, they put out information that says the U.S. does maintain nuclear weapons at foreign bases overseas. So I'm just saying.
Go ahead.
No, go for it.
I mean, bases are vulnerable to attack, whether they're here or overseas, right? I mean, that's been true, right? We build our force posture to try and lessen that, but I think it does call for, John mentioned regional missile defenses. That's a capability we've invested in. We should continue investing in. You also have to be able to, potentially, if you have nuclear weapons based anywhere, whether it's at a bomber base in the United States or overseas, the ability to get it away from the base. A base is a large known target. Adversaries will target it even if they're not intending to target nuclear weapons. They want to target where your military aircraft are operating from. You need to be able to get your military aircraft and presumably some set of your nuclear weapons, if you're in a crisis or conflict, away from that. So whether it's dispersing bombers or dispersing dual-capable aircraft that are associated with NATO or whatever, you have to have those kind of things in place. But I mean, it's a war. Bases are going to get attacked. Like that's part of warfighting. You have to be prepared for it.
I think I would just add that it's, just shows that the U.S. is not impenetrable, and I don't think anyone thinks that we are, but I think there has to be an understanding that even with the best defense systems possible, things will get through, especially with the novel uses of drones, especially with the novel weapons that are now being utilized. And I think that's an important consideration. I would just flag that in such an environment where things will get through and you have numerous players and a challenge to attribute and maybe a diminishment in international law that would sort of allow for more clarity or transparency on what is happening, that's when you most desperately need the ability to communicate clearly and the ability to parse through what's happening on the ground, because the fog of war that exists no matter what during war will get even worse if we somehow think we don't need those communication capacities or we don't need those networks and connections. And so, I think it just argues for closer connectivity and more communication as much as possible with all of our allies in the event that there are attacks going on our bases in their territory.
Let's get someone in the back. Yes, the gentleman in the very back.
Thank you. If an adversary were to launch a preemptive first strike before the golden boondoggle is fully operational, how would the U.S. respond? Would we use nukes? Or is it more likely that our adversaries would rather we spend ourselves into a financial crisis by sinking trillions into this golden boondoggle?
I'll try to take the first whack here. So, if a country launches a nuclear weapon at us, the United States is going to use all the means at its disposal to defend itself, defend its allies, and to attack that country. Now, the nature of the conflict, the nature of the adversary will dictate what that response looks like. Every president, even this one, has wisely said, I'm not going to commit myself explicitly a priori to a specific response. We don't need to tell that. But we're very specific when we say to North Korea, if they use a nuclear weapon against us or allies, that's the end of the Kim regime. Period. Russia and China know that if they launch a nuclear weapon at us, they are likely to face a nuclear reprisal. That is one of the reasons, probably not the dominant reason, but one of the reasons they don't launch nuclear weapons at us. They probably don't launch nuclear weapons at us because they're not really interested in starting a nuclear war. There's no real benefit for them to do so in regular situation. So it's not that we then pivot and say, okay, you nuked us, don't worry, we're going to get Golden Dome ready. I don't think that's the dynamic here. I think the question is, what is the circumstance under which the United States is attacked with a nuclear weapon? In that situation, things are horrible. The United States is at war, or we are in a massive crisis and miscommunication where we're trying to figure out what is going on and how. That's welcome to a world with nuclear weapons. You can't, one, Golden Dome doesn't work. Two, if it's built and it has any working capability, it's likely not going to be built with a single point of failure. And so the idea is that you've got resiliency to your systems. What we're trying to avoid is war. We're good at that in certain circumstances. We're bad at that, clearly, in other circumstances. I don't think Golden Dome is likely to start a war. And I don't think that having Golden Dome is likely to prevent the United States from suffering damage. The question is, with all of the different things, from educating your children to hitting the button, how are you structuring your society and the global security environment? And are we prioritizing things well? And having been doing this for a while, we're not at our best right now, but standby operators are working, and we hope to be with you soon.
I would also note we've pursued national missile defense in the past. SDI, we have national missile defense today that started more than 2 decades ago. The Soviets and the Russians complained about them. They invested in things that were countermeasures. What they did not do was attempt a preemptive.
We just don't know all of the various different complications. If we're already in a war and a country, this is years in the future, a country thinks Golden Dome will prevent a certain amount of missiles from getting through, and they thus do a larger, a larger attack to try to get through Golden Dome, and they, either intentionally or unintentionally are more effective in damaging us than they intended to be, and it immediately escalates, and this could be a conventional attack, and they somehow don't think they're going to go through. I mean, even look at the attack on Israel several years ago, where it was a large volley of missiles from Iran, and some got through and some didn't. And their calculus may have changed because they were factoring in Israel's missile defense. I think my concern is that we play out scenarios, we tabletop, we have deterrence experts across the board looking at all of these different scenarios to control escalation, but we don't account for the numerous variables that we cannot predict. The credibility of one particular president versus another president, the predilection to protect allies or not protect allies in different administrations, the belief that your missile is going to be more or less effective based on the advocacy for a defense system that does or does not work. And I think why we need so many of the international legal and normative architectures that we put in place after World War II to stay in place is just to allow for some predictability in our processes, allow for some capacity to communicate, allow for some consequences if violations of those normative and legal architectures go forward, so that we can, again, feel that in this world of unpredictable circumstances, we at least know where we're starting from with respect to engagement on a warfare front. And I think as we see that normative and legal architecture declining, we also see the variables increasing, right? The effectiveness of programs, the credibility of alliances, and the US government itself. And that's what makes the situation so dangerous right now. And I think, to your point, it's not going to be Golden Dome that starts or ends a war, but it could just allow for an additional exacerbation of the planning, of the thinking of both adversaries and allies.
All right, so we are right at time at 2:05. Thank you all for providing your insights. A very good discussion, and that concludes our entire Nuclear Non-Proliferation Conference. So first, would like to thank all of you up here, and then to the rest of our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know you all have a lot going on, but we very much appreciate you providing your insights on this very important topic. We'd like to thank the AV development and conference teams. Y'all put this all together. We're very grateful for that. And then finally, thank you all to the audience. You asked some great questions. And with that, we are doing a reception in the lobby where we'll have some food and refreshments. So please do join us there. Thank you.